Hey folks, and welcome to my first cryptid deep dive. Today, we're heading to the Buckeye State, and I've got to tell you, Ohio might just be the most underrated cryptid hotspot in America. We're not talking about your standard Bigfoot fare here. No, Ohio brings something special to the table. We've got frog people, lake monsters, creatures with 2x4s, and things that are so bizarre they sound like they escaped from a fever dream. Before we start, I'd love to know something. If you actually live in the USA, which state are you listening from and what time is it right now? Perhaps you actually live in Ohio and get to experience these cryptids firsthand. I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. This video is designed to be your companion for the next 2 hours, something you can relax to, work alongside, or even drift off to as we explore Ohio's strangest tales. So get comfortable, settle in, and let's dive into some truly bizarre folklore together. Chapter 1. The Loveland Frogman. We're starting strong with what might be Ohio's most famous cryptid, and honestly, one of the weirdest creatures in American folklore. The Loveland Frogman. Now, when I first heard about this, I thought someone was pulling my leg. A 4-foot-tall frog that walks on 2 legs? Come on. But here's the thing. This creature was reportedly seen by police officers multiple times. And these weren't just random sightings in the dead of night by people who maybe had a few too many at the local bar. These were credible witnesses doing their jobs. Let's set the scene. It's March 3rd, 1972, around 1 in the morning. Officer Ray Shockey of the Loveland Police Department is driving along Riverside Drive near the Little Miami River. It's a quiet night, the kind where you're mostly just making sure everything's peaceful and maybe thinking about what you're going to have for breakfast in a few hours. Then suddenly, in his headlights, he sees something on the side of the road. Now, Officer Shockey initially thinks it's a dog. Makes sense, right? But as he gets closer, this thing stands up, on 2 legs, and it's not a dog, not even close. What Shockey describes is something that sounds like it walked straight out of a science fiction novel. 4 feet tall, leathery skin, a face that's distinctly frog-like, and the kicker, webbed hands. This thing looks at the patrol car for a moment, and then it does what any sensible frog monster would do. It hops over the guardrail and heads down toward the river. Shockey, to his credit, doesn't just dismiss this as his imagination or exhaustion. He reports it. He files an official report describing exactly what he saw. And here's where it gets even more interesting. 2 weeks later, on March 17th, another Loveland officer named Mark Matthews has his own encounter. Matthews is also driving along Riverside Drive when he spots what he thinks is an animal lying in the road, possibly injured or dead. Matthews gets out of his car to check on it, and the animal sits up. It's the same creature Shockey described. 4 feet tall, leathery skin, frog-like face. Matthews, being a police officer, draws his weapon. The creature starts to move toward the guardrail, and Matthews, in what I can only assume was a moment of absolute panic mixed with duty, fires at it. He says he hit it, but the creature still managed to climb over the guardrail and disappear. Now, here's where the story gets a bit muddy, no pun intended. Years later, in 2016, Officer Matthews gave an interview where he walked back some of his story. He claimed it was just a large iguana, probably someone's escaped pet, and that the whole frogman thing had been blown out of proportion. But here's my question. If you're a trained police officer and you see an iguana, even a big one, are you really going to describe it as having leathery, frog-like skin and standing 4 feet tall on 2 legs? Iguanas can get big, sure, but they don't typically stand upright and stare at you like they're contemplating whether you're friend or foe. Plus, and this is important, there were earlier sightings. Back in 1955, a businessman claimed he saw 3 of these creatures under a bridge near Loveland. He described them as having wrinkled skin, wide lipless mouths, and he even claimed one of them was holding some kind of wand or rod that gave off sparks. Now that detail is where things get a bit too science fiction for me, but the basic description matches what the officers would report 17 years later. The Little Miami River area has been a hotspot for these sightings, and locals still talk about the Frogman today. Some people think it could be a misidentified animal, maybe a large salamander or a deformed creature of some kind. Others think it's something genuinely unknown, possibly some kind of amphibian that evolved in isolation, or a creature that's managed to avoid scientific classification. And then there are those who think the whole thing is a hoax or mass hysteria. But here's what I find compelling. These weren't random people looking for attention. These were police officers, people trained to observe and report accurately, who saw something strange enough that they were willing to file official reports and stand by those reports, at least initially. Whatever was in Loveland in 1972, it scared experienced officers enough that one of them drew his weapon and fired. The Loveland Frogman remains one of Ohio's most enduring cryptid legends, and whether it's a real creature, a case of misidentification, or something else entirely, it's captured the imagination of people for over 50 years now. Chapter 2. The Ohio Grassman. All right, let's talk about Ohio's answer to Bigfoot. But here's the thing. The Ohio Grassman isn't just a Midwestern knockoff of the Pacific Northwest's most famous cryptid. According to witnesses and researchers, the Grassman is meaner, more aggressive, and has some unique behaviors that set it apart from its western cousins. The Grassman, sometimes called the Kenmore Grassman, or the Orange Eyes, is described as a 7 to 10 foot tall, bipedal ape-like creature covered in matted dark hair. Witnesses report a powerful muscular build, long arms, and a face that's more ape than human. But what really sets the Grassman apart are those eyes. Multiple witnesses describe glowing orange or yellow eyes that seem to pierce right through you, especially at night. The name Grassman comes from one of this creature's most distinctive behaviors. Unlike other Bigfoot-type creatures that might build simple shelters or lean-tos, the Grassman is known for constructing elaborate nests made of grass, branches, and other vegetation. These aren't just random piles of plant material either. Witnesses describe carefully woven structures, sometimes reaching 6 or 7 feet in diameter, found deep in Ohio's forests. Salt Fork State Park, located in Guernsey County, has become ground zero for Grassman activity. This park covers over 20,000 acres of dense forest, rolling hills, and remote wilderness, perfect habitat for a creature that wants to avoid human contact. Starting in the 1960s and continuing through today, hikers, campers, and park rangers have reported strange encounters in these woods. One of the most detailed sightings occurred in 1978, when 2 separate groups of campers reported seeing a large, hair-covered creature moving through the trees near their campsites. The creature was estimated to be around 8 feet tall and moved with a purposeful, almost human gait. What made this sighting particularly credible was that the 2 groups were camping in different areas of the park and reported their sightings independently, yet their descriptions matched almost perfectly. But the Grassman isn't just content to be seen from a distance. Multiple reports describe aggressive behavior, territory marking, and intimidation tactics. Campers have reported being pelted with rocks and sticks thrown from the tree line. Others describe terrifying vocalizations, deep whooping calls and screams that echo through the forest at night. Some witnesses report finding their campsites destroyed after venturing away for a hike, with coolers torn open, tents ripped, and supplies scattered. In 1981, a group of hunters in Salt Fork State Park had an encounter that they still talk about today. They were tracking a deer when they heard something massive moving through the underbrush. Thinking it might be a bear, which are rare but present in Ohio, they moved to get a better look. What they saw was no bear. A creature standing upright, easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair, was watching them from behind a tree. The hunters, experienced outdoorsmen who'd spent their entire lives in these woods, were so unnerved that they abandoned their hunt and left the area immediately. The Grassman has also been blamed for livestock deaths and disappearances in the counties surrounding Salt Fork. Farmers have reported chickens, goats, and even calves going missing, with large, human-like footprints found near the scene. These prints, typically measuring 15 to 18 inches long and showing clear toe impressions, don't match any known animal in Ohio. What makes the Grassman particularly interesting from a cryptozoology standpoint is the consistency of the reports. Unlike some cryptids where descriptions vary wildly, Grassman witnesses describe remarkably similar features: the massive size, the dark matted hair, those distinctive glowing eyes, the aggressive territorial behavior, and of course, those elaborate grass nests. Researchers have found dozens of these nests throughout Ohio's forests, particularly in the Salt Fork area. Some appear fresh, while others look like they've been there for years. Skeptics argue these could be natural formations, or even beds made by deer, but the intricate weaving and the sheer size of some of these structures suggest something with opposable thumbs and considerable intelligence built them. Is the Grassman real? That's the million-dollar question. Ohio has plenty of remote wilderness where a large primate could theoretically exist undetected. The state's forests have rebounded significantly since the early 1900s, providing vast tracts of habitat. But a breeding population of 10-foot-tall apes living in Ohio? That's a hard sell for most scientists. What we do know is that people continue to report encounters with something in Ohio's forests. Whether it's an undiscovered primate, a case of mistaken identity, or something else entirely, the legend of the Grassman remains one of Ohio's most compelling cryptid mysteries. Chapter 3: Mothman, Ohio Sightings. Now, I know what you're thinking. Mothman? Isn't that West Virginia's thing? And you'd be right. Mothman is most famously associated with Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and the tragic Silver Bridge collapse of 1967. But here's what a lot of people don't know. The Ohio side of the river had its own wave of Mothman sightings, and some researchers argue that Ohio might have actually had encounters before West Virginia made the creature famous. For those not familiar with the Mothman legend, we're talking about a creature described as a large, winged humanoid, standing somewhere between 6 and 7 feet tall, with a wingspan that witnesses estimate at 10 feet or more. But the most distinctive and terrifying feature are the eyes. Glowing red eyes set wide apart where the creature's shoulders would be, that seem to hypnotize witnesses and leave them with a sense of dread that lasts long after the encounter. The Silver Bridge connected Point Pleasant, West Virginia, with Gallipolis, Ohio, spanning the Ohio River. In the 13 months leading up to the bridge's collapse on December 15, 1967, which killed 46 people, residents on both sides of the river reported seeing this strange creature. But while Point Pleasant got most of the attention, Gallipolis and the surrounding Ohio communities had their own encounters. One of the earliest Ohio sightings actually predates the famous Point Pleasant encounters. In November 1966, just days before the McClintock Wildlife Station sightings that would make Mothman famous, residents near Gallipolis reported seeing a large gray creature with wings perched on a barn roof. The witnesses, a local farming family, described feeling an overwhelming sense of fear and dread, even though the creature didn't make any aggressive moves. It simply sat there, those red eyes glowing in the darkness, watching them. Throughout late 1966 and all of 1967, residents of Gallipolis, Cheshire, and other Ohio River communities reported dozens of sightings. People saw the creature flying over the river, perched on trees near the bridge, and in some cases, following their cars along Route 7. Multiple witnesses reported the same experience, driving at night when suddenly those red eyes would appear in their rearview mirror, and no matter how fast they drove, the creature kept pace, sometimes for miles. What made the Ohio sightings particularly interesting was the timing. Many occurred in clusters, multiple witnesses in the same area reporting encounters within days or even hours of each other. And unlike some cryptid sightings where you might question the credibility of the witnesses, these reports came from teachers, police officers, business owners, ordinary people going about their daily lives who suddenly found themselves face to face with something they couldn't explain. One particularly chilling account comes from a young couple who were parked near the Ohio riverbank in December 1967, just weeks before the bridge collapse. They were talking when they heard a sound they described as something between a woman's scream and a high-pitched squeal. Looking up, they saw a massive creature with wings spread wide, gliding silently toward their car. The creature passed directly overhead, so close they could see the texture of its wings and those unmistakable red eyes. They started their car and fled, but both reported feeling physically ill for days afterward, plagued by nightmares and a sense of impending doom. After the Silver Bridge collapsed, killing 46 people during rush hour traffic on December 15, 1967, Mothman sightings dropped off dramatically on both sides of the river. This led to one of the most persistent theories about the creature, that Mothman appears as a harbinger of disaster, a warning of terrible events to come. Skeptics argue this is just confirmation bias, people retrofitting their sightings with meaning after a tragedy. But witnesses who saw the creature in those months leading up to the collapse will tell you there was something otherworldly about their encounters, a sense that this wasn't just an unknown animal, but something fundamentally different. Ohio continued to have sporadic Mothman sightings over the years, though nothing like the concentration of encounters in 1966 and 1967. In 2007, right before the I-35W bridge collapse in Minnesota, there were reports of Mothman-like creatures in the area. Some Ohio residents claim to have seen similar creatures near bridges in Cincinnati and Cleveland around the same time, though these reports never gained the same traction. The question of what Mothman actually is remains hotly debated. Skeptics point to large birds like sandhill cranes or owls, which can have impressive wingspans and reflective eyes. But witnesses who've seen both large birds and Mothman will tell you there's no comparison. This creature moves wrong, has a presence that birds simply don't have, and those eyes don't reflect light like an animal's eyes. They glow with their own internal light. Whether Mothman is a real creature, a mass hallucination, or something that defies conventional explanation, its connection to Ohio is undeniable. The Ohio River communities lived through the same fear and wonder as their West Virginia neighbors, and their stories deserve to be part of the Mothman legend. Chapter 4. South Bay Bessie. Let's head to the shores of Lake Erie, because Ohio's cryptid scene isn't just limited to land. Meet South Bay Bessie, Lake Erie's very own lake monster, and one of the most frequently cited aquatic cryptids in North America. We're talking about hundreds of sightings spanning over 2 centuries, from Native American accounts through modern-day encounters with commercial fishermen and recreational boaters. Bessie, as she's affectionately known, is typically described as a serpent-like creature measuring anywhere from 30 to 40 feet long, though some witnesses claim even larger sizes. Unlike lake monsters from other regions that might be described as dinosaur-like or with multiple humps, Bessie is consistently described as snake-like, with a body thickness of about 12 to 18 inches, dark gray or greenish-brown coloring, and a head that some witnesses say resembles a dog or a horse. The earliest recorded sightings of Bessie date back to the late 1700s and early 1800s. Native American tribes in the region, including the Erie people for whom the lake is named, had stories of a massive serpent that lived in the waters. Early European settlers dismissed these as mythology until they started having their own encounters. In 1817, a group of men near Sandusky Bay reported seeing a massive snake-like creature moving through the water with its head raised several feet above the surface. But Bessie really hit the mainstream in 1931, when several people at Cedar Point Amusement Park, including the park's accountant and his wife, spotted a large serpentine creature in the water. This wasn't a quick glimpse either. The creature was visible for several minutes, moving through the water parallel to the shore, allowing dozens of witnesses to observe it. The local newspaper ran the story, and suddenly everyone was talking about the Lake Erie Monster. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, sightings increased dramatically. Commercial fishermen working the lake reported encounters with something massive moving beneath their boats, sometimes coming up close enough that they could see the creature's body through the clear water. In 1969, a fishing boat captain named John Schaffner had an encounter that he swore was no fish. He described a creature at least 35 feet long with a flat, snake-like head moving through the water near his vessel. What spooked him wasn't just the size, but the way it moved more deliberately than any known fish, almost as if it were curious about the boat. One of the most credible sightings occurred in 1983 when several members of a Port Dover charter fishing boat spotted Bessie near the Ohio shoreline. These weren't amateur fishermen or tourists looking for attention. These were people who'd spent their entire lives on Lake Erie, who knew every fish species in the lake, and they all agreed that what they saw was nothing they'd ever encountered before. The creature surfaced about 1,000 feet from their boat, showing about 30 feet of its length, moving in a smooth, undulating motion before disappearing back into the depths. What makes Bessie particularly interesting is that sightings aren't limited to one area of the lake. Reports come from the entire southern shore, from Toledo to Cleveland to Erie, Pennsylvania. The creature, or possibly multiple creatures, seems to move throughout the lake, with sightings sometimes occurring in the open water and other times near shore or in bays. So what could Bessie actually be? Skeptics offer several explanations. Sturgeon, which can grow to impressive sizes and have been known to reach lengths of 10 to 12 feet in the Great Lakes region. Floating logs or debris that people misidentify as a living creature. Waves and water patterns that create the illusion of something moving through the water. Schools of fish moving together that, from a distance, could look like one large creature. But here's the problem with all those explanations. Lake Erie isn't that deep, with an average depth of only 62 feet, and it's heavily trafficked and well studied. If sturgeon or some other known fish were regularly growing to 30 or 40 feet, we'd have physical evidence by now. Professional fishermen, people who understand water patterns and wave action, are among the most frequent witnesses. These aren't people who are easily fooled by floating logs. Could Bessie be a relic population of some prehistoric creature? It's tempting to think so, but Lake Erie is only about 10,000 to 12,000 years old, formed at the end of the last ice age. Any creature living there would have had to either evolve remarkably quickly or migrate in from somewhere else, and maintaining a breeding population of 30-foot aquatic creatures in a relatively shallow lake without conclusive physical evidence is, well, hard to explain. Yet the sightings continue. In 2001, a video emerged showing something large moving through the water near Sandusky. Analysis was inconclusive, skeptics said. It was debris or fish. Believers said it showed a creature. In 2011, charter boat captains reported multiple sightings over a 2-week period, all describing the same thing, a large, dark, serpentine creature moving through the water. The town of Huron, Ohio, has embraced Bessie as a local legend, even offering a $100,000 reward for anyone who can capture live, physical proof of the creature's existence. So far, nobody's claimed that reward. Bessie, if she exists, remains as elusive as ever, a mystery lurking in the depths of Lake Erie. Chapter 5. The Melon Heads. All right, we need to talk about the Melon Heads, and I'm warning you right now, this one gets dark. We're moving from creatures that are strange or frightening to something that taps into genuinely disturbing territory. The Melon Heads are one of Ohio's most unsettling legends, combining elements of cryptozoology with urban legend and very real fears about government experimentation and abuse. The Melon Heads are described as small humanoids, typically said to be between 4 and 5 feet tall, with disproportionately large, bulbous heads. Their skin is described as pale, almost translucent, and their eyes are said to be larger than normal human eyes. Witnesses report that they move in groups, rarely alone, and are extremely aggressive toward anyone who ventures into their territory. That territory, according to legend, is the woods around Kirtland, particularly Wisner Road and Chardon, which locals have dubbed Melon Head Road. The origin story of the Melon Heads varies depending on who you ask, but the most common version involves a mysterious figure known as Dr. Crow. According to the legend, in the early 1900s, Dr. Crow ran an asylum or orphanage in the Kirtland area. The details get fuzzy here. Some versions say he was conducting experiments on the children in his care, possibly involving hydrocephalus or other conditions that cause abnormal head growth. Other versions claim he was deliberately creating these creatures through genetic experiments or exposure to chemicals. The story goes that Dr. Crow's experiments went horribly wrong, or perhaps they went exactly as he planned, depending on the version. The children developed these enlarged heads, became violent and unpredictable, and eventually turned on Dr. Crow himself, killing him and burning down the facility. The surviving Melon Heads escaped into the surrounding woods, where they've supposedly lived ever since, emerging at night to scare, attack, or even kill anyone who intrudes on their territory. Now, let's separate fact from fiction here, because this is where things get murky. There's no historical record of a Dr. Crow running an asylum or orphanage in Kirtland. No records of experiments, no documented facility that matches the legend. However, there are elements of truth woven into this story that might explain its persistence. Ohio did have several institutions in the early to mid-1900s that housed people with various conditions, including developmental disabilities. The care at some of these facilities was, to put it mildly, horrific. Patients were often neglected, abused, and yes, in some cases, subjected to medical experiments that would be considered unconscionable today. While there's no evidence of anyone creating Melon Heads, the real history of institutionalized abuse in America could easily fuel legends like this. The other element that adds fuel to this fire is that people genuinely report seeing something in the Kirtland Woods. Throughout the 1970s, 1980s, and continuing to today, people driving down Wisner Road late at night report encounters with strange figures. These figures are described as moving quickly through the trees, sometimes running alongside cars, peering out from the tree line with disproportionately large heads silhouetted against the moonlight. In 1983, a group of teenagers decided to drive down Melon Head Road as a dare, because teenagers have been making questionable decisions since the dawn of time. According to their account, they were driving slowly, joking and laughing about the legend when something hit their car. Not a rock thrown by a person, but something that struck with enough force to dent the roof. They sped up, and through the rearview mirror, they claimed to see several small figures standing in the road behind them, watching them leave. Local police have been called to the area numerous times over the years, responding to reports of prowlers, strange figures, and teenagers who got more than they bargained for while seeking out the Melon Heads. Officers who've patrolled the area will tell you that something about those woods feels off, though most are quick to add that they've never personally seen anything that would confirm the legend. Skeptics, and I include myself in this camp to some degree, point out that the Melon Head legend shares a lot of similarities with other local legends across the country. There's a phenomenon in folklore studies where variations of the same story pop up in different regions, always with local details changed to make it feel authentic to that area. The basic template of escaped patients or experimental subjects living in the woods shows up everywhere from Michigan to Connecticut. It's also worth noting that Wisner Road and the surrounding area are popular spots for teenagers looking for a scare, which means there's a built-in audience of suggestible witnesses, often at night, often already primed to see something scary. The power of suggestion combined with darkness, unfamiliar woods, and natural sounds can create encounters that feel very real, even if nothing objectively unusual happened. But then there are the witnesses who aren't teenagers on a ghost hunt. Adults, sometimes driving alone, who report seeing figures that don't match any rational explanation. People who've lived in the area their entire lives and swear that something unusual inhabits those woods. The Melon Heads remain one of Ohio's most controversial cryptids, existing in this uncomfortable space between urban legend and something that might have basis in reality. Whether they're real creatures, misidentified people, or animals, or purely the product of local folklore, they've secured their place in Ohio's cryptid pantheon, and they're not going away anytime soon. Chapter 6. The Minerva Monster. We're heading to Minerva, a small village in Stark County, and we're going to talk about one of the most well-documented and frankly terrifying Bigfoot encounters in Ohio history. The Minerva Monster case is special because it wasn't just a fleeting glimpse in the woods. This was a sustained encounter over several weeks with multiple witnesses, physical evidence, and even police involvement. This is the real deal, folks. Our story centers on the Caton family, specifically Evelyn and Hal Caton, and their 2 teenage grandchildren who were staying with them in August 1978. The Caton home was located on a rural property with fields and woods nearby, the kind of place where you'd expect to see deer, maybe a fox or a raccoon, but nothing that would cause you to question your sanity. On the evening of August 21st, 1978, the Caton family heard their horses making a commotion in the field behind their house. This wasn't unusual. Horses can be spooked by all sorts of things, but the level of panic in the animal's behavior caught their attention. The family looked out their kitchen window, and what they saw changed their lives forever. Standing at the edge of their property, just at the tree line, was a massive, hair-covered creature. The family estimated it stood 7 feet tall, maybe more, with broad shoulders and arms that seemed too long for its body. The creature was covered in dark, shaggy hair, matted and dirty-looking. But what really stuck with them, and what they'd describe in detail to investigators later, was the creature's face. It was more ape-like than human, with a flat nose, a heavy brow, and eyes that reflected the porch light back at them. The creature didn't immediately run away. Instead, it stood there, swaying slightly, watching the house. The family watched it back, nobody quite believing what they were seeing. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, the creature turned and walked back into the woods, moving with a smooth bipedal gait that was distinctly not human and definitely not bear. The Catons called the police. Now you might think that'd be the end of it. Police would show up, find nothing, file a report about concerned citizens seeing a bear, and everyone would move on with their lives. But that's not what happened. The Minerva police took the report seriously, and more importantly, they found evidence. Officers investigating the property found tracks. Large, human-like footprints measuring approximately 16 inches long and 7 inches wide, pressed deep into the soft soil at the edge of the woods. These weren't bear tracks. Anyone familiar with wildlife could see that. They showed clear impressions of toes, a heel, and an arch, arranged in a stride pattern consistent with a bipedal creature. The police photographed these tracks and made plaster casts, which still exist today. But here's where the story goes from interesting to genuinely frightening. The creature came back. Multiple times over the next several weeks, this thing kept returning to the Caton property. On one occasion, the creature actually approached the house, peering through the kitchen window while the family was inside. Imagine sitting in your own kitchen and seeing a 7-foot-tall, hair-covered creature with glowing eyes staring at you through the glass. The family was understandably terrified. During one of these return visits, Hal Caton grabbed his rifle and went outside, not to shoot the creature necessarily, but to protect his family and property. He came face to face with the creature at a distance of maybe 50 feet. Hal, a lifelong outdoorsman who'd hunted and fished in Ohio his entire life, said it was unlike anything he'd ever seen. The creature seemed just as surprised to see him as he was to see it, and after a tense standoff, it retreated into the woods. Word spread through Minerva quickly, small towns being what they are, and soon other. Residents started reporting their own sightings and experiences. A local gas station owner reported seeing a similar creature cross the road near his business. A farmer found mysterious tracks in his field that matched the description of what police found on the Caton property. Hunters reported finding areas in the nearby woods where trees had been broken and twisted in ways that would require enormous strength. Local media picked up the story, and Minerva became ground zero for Bigfoot enthusiasts from across the country. Researchers descended on the area with recording equipment, cameras, and plaster casting materials. Some of these investigators interviewed dozens of locals and compiled a surprisingly robust set of data suggesting that something unusual was indeed occurring in Stark County. One particular piece of evidence that researchers found compelling was the consistency of the reports. When investigators interviewed witnesses separately, their descriptions matched remarkably well. 7 feet tall or more, dark matted hair, a powerful musky odor, those glowing eyes, and that distinctive bipedal gait. These weren't people comparing notes and aligning their stories. These were independent witnesses describing the same thing. The activity around Minerva decreased significantly by late September 1978, though sporadic sightings continued for years afterward. The Caton family moved away from the property, and who could blame them? The emotional toll of having a creature repeatedly visit your home, of not feeling safe in the place you're supposed to feel most secure, that's not something most people can just shrug off. The Minerva Monster case remains one of the most credible Bigfoot encounters in Ohio history. You've got multiple witnesses, physical evidence in the form of tracks and casts, police documentation, and a timeline of events that's remarkably consistent. Skeptics argue it could have been a bear, despite the tracks clearly not being bear tracks. Others suggest a hoax, though the Caton family never profited from their experience, and by all accounts were reluctant witnesses who just wanted to be left alone. Whatever stalked the Caton property in 1978, it left an indelible mark on Minerva and on Ohio's cryptozoological history. Chapter 7. The Dogman of Defiance. Let's talk about one of Ohio's most terrifying cryptids, and I'm not using that word lightly. The Dogman of Defiance is something that, even among cryptid researchers who've heard it all, inspires a special kind of dread. We're talking about a creature that combines the worst aspects of a wolf with human-like intelligence, and, in at least one documented case, the apparent ability to use tools as weapons. Yeah, you heard that right. This thing picked up a 2x4. Defiance, located in northwestern Ohio near the Indiana border, had always been a quiet town. But in 1972, that changed when railway workers on the night shift started reporting encounters with something they couldn't explain. These weren't random civilians prone to exaggeration. These were working men, union railway workers who'd seen their share of wildlife along the tracks and weren't easily spooked. The creature they described was like something from a nightmare, standing between 6 and 7 feet tall when upright, but capable of dropping to all fours and moving with terrifying speed. The body was covered in dark, coarse fur, with powerful muscles visible beneath. But it was the head that really stuck with witnesses. This wasn't a bear or a deformed dog. This was something with a distinctly wolf-like face, an elongated snout filled with visible teeth, pointed ears, and eyes that glowed with an amber or yellowish color in the darkness. The first few sightings followed a pattern. Workers would see the creature watching them from a distance, just at the edge of their work lights. It moved with an intelligence that unnerved them, seeming to study their activities rather than simply wandering by like a curious animal might. Some workers reported hearing vocalizations, deep growls that they felt in their chest, and occasionally a howl that didn't sound quite like any wolf or coyote they'd heard before. Then things escalated. In late August 1972, 2 railway workers were performing maintenance on a section of track in a particularly isolated area just outside Defiance. It was around 2 in the morning, that dead time of night when everything feels more ominous. They heard something moving in the trees beside the tracks, heavy footfalls that were definitely too big to be a deer or a dog. One of the workers shined his flashlight toward the sound, and that's when they saw it. The Dogman standing upright about 30 feet away, just watching them. But this encounter was different from the previous ones. The creature didn't run. Instead, it moved closer, dropping to all fours and approaching in a way that both men later described as stalking behavior, like a predator sizing up prey. The workers, understandably terrified, grabbed the tools closest to them. One had a heavy wrench, the other had a railroad spike. They yelled at the creature, hoping to scare it off the way you might try to intimidate a wild animal. And here's where this story enters truly bizarre territory. The creature stopped, stood back up on two legs, and reached down to grab a piece of lumber that was lying near the tracks. A 2x4, about 4 feet long. It didn't just pick it up, it wielded it, holding it in a way that suggested understanding of what a weapon was. The creature advanced on the workers, swinging the 2x4 in what both men described as a threatening manner. At this point, survival instinct kicked in. The workers ran. They dropped their tools and sprinted back toward their truck, not daring to look back until they were safely inside with the doors locked. Through the window, they could see the creature, still holding the 2x4, standing in the middle of the tracks, watching them. They reported the incident to their supervisor, who initially thought they might have been drinking on the job. But these were long-time employees with no history of problems, and their terror was genuine. The supervisor filed a report, and local police were notified. An investigation of the area the next day found that 2x4, now snapped in half, lying in the dirt near the tracks. There were also prints in the soft earth, canine-like but much larger than any dog, with some appearing to show the creature transitioning between two-legged and four-legged movement. Word spread through the railway worker community, and soon other workers came forward with their own encounters. A conductor reported seeing the creature running alongside the train one night, keeping pace at over 30 miles per hour before veering off into the woods. A maintenance crew found a deer carcass that had been torn apart with a violence that suggested something much more powerful than coyotes. The sightings around Defiance continued sporadically throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, though never with the same intensity as that summer of 1972. Hunters in the area reported encounters with a large wolf-like creature that would watch them from a distance, seemingly unafraid. Farmers lost livestock under mysterious circumstances, finding their animals killed but not eaten, as if something had killed for the sake of killing. The Dogman phenomenon isn't unique to Ohio. Similar creatures have been reported in Michigan, Wisconsin, and other Midwest states. Some researchers believe these might be related to werewolf legends brought over by European settlers, particularly from Germanic regions. Others think they could be a misidentified known animal, perhaps wolves or coyotes suffering from mange that makes them look more monstrous, or even large feral dogs. But the tool use, that's the detail that sets the Defiance encounter apart. If these railway workers are telling the truth, and investigators who interviewed them believed they were, then we're talking about something with a level of intelligence that goes beyond what we'd expect from any known canine species. The ability to recognize a piece of lumber as a potential weapon and to wield it in a threatening manner that suggests problem-solving ability and understanding of cause and effect. Could it have been a hoax? Two workers conspiring to make up a story for attention? Possible, but unlikely. They didn't profit from the story. They actually faced ridicule and skepticism from some co-workers, and the genuine fear in their initial report doesn't line up with people perpetrating a prank. The Dogman of Defiance remains one of Ohio's most enigmatic cryptids. The combination of physical power, apparent intelligence, and aggressive behavior makes it one of the more frightening creatures in American cryptozoology. And somewhere in the woods around Defiance, railway workers still tell new hires about the summer of 1972 and the thing that picked up a 2x4. Chapter 8. The Charles Mill Lake Monster. Let's head to Ashland County and Charles Mill Lake, because we need to talk about one of the strangest creatures in Ohio cryptozoology. The Charles Mill Lake Monster, also sometimes called the Orange Eyes for reasons that'll become clear, is bizarre even by cryptid standards. We're talking about an 11-foot-tall, armless humanoid with webbed feet and glowing green eyes. Yeah, this one's weird even for me. Charles Mill Lake is a reservoir created in 1936 when the Army Corps of Engineers dammed the Black Fork of the Mohican River. It's a peaceful spot, popular with fishermen and boaters, surrounded by forests and rolling hills. But on the night of March 28, 1959, 3 friends would have an encounter at this lake that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The 3 men, all in their early 20s, had driven out to Charles Mill Lake for some night fishing. They parked near the shore, set up their gear, and were enjoying a quiet evening when they heard something moving in the woods behind them. Now, this is Ohio. Woods make noise. Animals move around at night. This wasn't immediately alarming, but the sound kept getting closer, and it was heavy, much heavier than a deer or even a bear would make. They turned their flashlights toward the tree line, and that's when they saw it. Emerging from the woods was a creature that looked like nothing they'd ever seen or could explain. The thing stood at least 11 feet tall, towering over them even from a distance. Its body was humanoid in shape, standing upright on 2 legs, but there was something fundamentally wrong about its proportions. The torso was thick and barrel-shaped. The legs were muscular but seemed too short for the body. And here's the really bizarre part. It had no visible arms. The creature's skin, or what they could see of it in their flashlight beams, appeared to be a grayish-green color, with a texture they described as smooth, but somehow unnatural. Its head was roughly oval-shaped, and the eyes, those eyes were what really stuck with them. Glowing green, not reflecting the flashlight like an animal's eyes would, but emitting their own luminescence, like something radioactive. But wait, it gets weirder. The creature had webbed feet, large, splayed feet with visible webbing between the toes, clearly visible as it walked toward them across the muddy shore. The creature moved with a strange, lurching gait. Each step seemed labored, as if moving on land was difficult for it. The 3 men, frozen in terror for what they later estimated was about 30 seconds but felt like an eternity, finally broke and ran for their car. They didn't grab their fishing gear, didn't pack up their supplies, just ran. They could hear the creature following them, those heavy footfalls getting closer. They reached the car, piled in, and one of them, hands shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition, finally started the engine. As they sped away, looking back through the rear window, they could see the creature standing in the road behind them, those green eyes still visible in the darkness. Then it turned and walked back toward the lake, disappearing into the water with barely a splash. The men drove straight to the Ashland County Sheriff's Office and reported what they'd seen. The deputy who took their statement noted that all 3 men were genuinely terrified, pale, and shaking. These weren't kids looking for attention or drunk college students playing a prank. These were grown men, clearly traumatized by whatever they'd encountered. The sheriff's department investigated the site the next day. They found the men's fishing equipment right where they'd left it in their panic. They also found tracks in the mud near the water's edge. Large, unusual prints that showed clear webbing between the toe impressions. The tracks led from the woods, across the beach area where the encounter occurred, and straight into the water, where they disappeared. Skeptics immediately jumped on the obvious explanation. What these men saw was simply a bear. Black bears were becoming more common in Ohio at that time, as populations recovered, and in poor lighting, a bear standing on its hind legs might look humanoid. But there are problems with that explanation. First, the height, 11 feet, is far too tall for any black bear in Ohio. Second, the webbed feet. Bears don't have webbed feet. Third, the description of the creature moving into the water and disappearing with barely a ripple doesn't match bear behavior at all. Could it have been a hoax? The men could have made up the story, but for what purpose? They faced ridicule and skepticism. Their story made them the subject of jokes around Ashland County. If it was a hoax, they committed to it completely and gained nothing from it. Some researchers have speculated that what these men saw might have been some kind of aquatic humanoid, possibly related to the Loveland Frogman or other amphibious cryptids reported in the region. The webbed feet and the creature's apparent comfort in water would support this theory. The Charles Mill Lake area does connect through various waterways to other parts of Ohio, where aquatic cryptids have been reported. The armless aspect is particularly puzzling. Some witnesses to aquatic humanoids report that the creatures keep their arms tight against their bodies when moving, which might give the appearance of being armless in poor lighting. Others suggest that if this was some kind of unknown aquatic species, it might have evolved without traditional arms, developing other means of movement and manipulation underwater. The glowing green eyes are another mystery. Bioluminescence exists in nature, particularly in deep-sea creatures, but an 11-foot-tall terrestrial or amphibious creature with bioluminescent eyes. That's not something science currently recognizes as existing. There have been a handful of other reports over the years, from the Charles Mill Lake area. Fishermen have reported seeing something large moving beneath the surface in areas where the water is too shallow for most fish. Campers have heard strange vocalizations coming from the lake at night, described as somewhere between a croak and a low moan. But nothing has ever matched the detail and terror of that March 1959 encounter. The Charles Mill Lake Monster remains one of Ohio's most bizarre and unexplained cryptid cases. The witnesses stuck to their story for decades, never wavering in their description, never admitting to a hoax. Whatever came out of that lake in 1959, it was something that 3 grown men couldn't explain, and something that left physical evidence that couldn't easily be dismissed. Chapter 9. The Peninsula Python. Time to talk about a cryptid that's a bit more straightforward than some of the others we've covered, but no less terrifying for the people who encountered it. The Peninsula Python was, according to reports from 1944, a massive snake that terrorized the small town of Peninsula in Summit County. We're talking about a 20-foot-long serpent that left behind evidence of its presence and then vanished as mysteriously as it appeared. Peninsula in 1944 was even smaller and more rural than it is today. The town sits in the Cuyahoga Valley, surrounded by dense forests and farmland. It's beautiful country, but it's also the kind of place where wildlife encounters are part of daily life. Farmers were used to dealing with foxes getting into chicken coops, deer eating their crops, maybe the occasional black bear passing through. But nobody was prepared for what showed up in the summer of 1944. The first indication that something unusual was in the area came when local farmers started finding their chicken coops empty, not just a few chickens missing, but entire flocks gone, sometimes 20 or 30 birds in a single night. The strange thing was, there was no sign of forced entry. No scattered feathers suggesting a struggle. No blood. The chickens were simply gone. Then came the tracks. Massive snake tracks, showing a body width of about 12 to 14 inches, pressed into the soft earth near the coops and leading off into the woods. These weren't little garter snake trails. These were the tracks of something huge, leaving deep impressions that suggested enormous weight. Farmers who followed the tracks reported that they led through the underbrush and into the more remote areas of the valley. The first actual sighting of the creature came in mid-July when a farmer named Robert Pukwudgie was working in his field near dusk. He heard a rustling in the tall grass at the edge of his property and turned to see what he initially thought was a fallen log moving through the vegetation. But logs don't move on their own. As he watched, he realized he was looking at a snake, but unlike any snake he'd ever seen in Ohio. The creature was at least 20 feet long, possibly longer, with a body as thick as a man's thigh. Its scales were a dark olive-green color, and as it moved, Pukwudgie could see the powerful muscles rippling beneath the skin. The snake was moving with purpose, not the meandering path you might expect from a snake just traveling through an area, but with direction, as if it knew exactly where it was going. Pukwudgie, wisely, didn't approach the creature. He watched it disappear into the woods and then immediately went to tell his neighbors what he'd seen. Within days, other residents reported their own sightings. A woman hanging laundry saw the snake sunning itself on a rock outcropping near the Cuyahoga River. A group of children playing near the woods ran home screaming after seeing what they described as a tree trunk with scales moving through the underbrush. The sightings created something close to panic in Peninsula. Parents kept their children inside. Farmers started carrying firearms when doing their work. Local hunters organized search parties to try to find and kill the creature. The story made regional newspapers with headlines like "Monster Snake Terrorizes Ohio Town" and "Peninsula Python Prowls Valley." But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. Despite all the searching, nobody could find the snake. The search parties found tracks, found areas where something large had clearly bedded down in the underbrush, even found what appeared to be shed skin, though the pieces were too damaged to definitively identify. But the creature itself remained elusive. The chicken disappearances stopped in mid-August, and the sightings tapered off. The last reported encounter was in early September, when a fisherman on the Cuyahoga River reported seeing something massive moving beneath the surface, creating a wake that seemed far too large for any fish in the river. After that, nothing. The Peninsula Python, if that's what it really was, simply vanished. So, what was the Peninsula Python? The most obvious explanation is that it was a pet snake, probably a python or a boa constrictor, that had either escaped or been released by its owner. Large constrictor snakes were less common as pets in the 1940s than they are today, but they weren't unheard of. A 20-foot python would be extraordinarily large, but not impossible. Reticulated pythons and anacondas can reach those lengths. The problem with that theory is survival. Ohio's climate is not hospitable to tropical snakes. Even in summer, nighttime temperatures can drop significantly, and a large constrictor would struggle to maintain body temperature. It's possible the snake survived the summer months, but couldn't have made it through a northeast Ohio winter. Yet there were no reports of finding a dead giant snake in the fall, or following, spring. Could it have been a native Ohio snake that was simply much larger than typical? The largest native snakes in Ohio are black rat snakes, which can reach 8 feet in rare cases, and the eastern fox snake, which maxes out around 6 feet. Neither comes close to 20 feet, and the tracks and descriptions don't match these species. Some cryptozoologists have suggested the Peninsula Python might have been a surviving population of some prehistoric snake species, or possibly an unknown species that occasionally emerges from deeper parts of the Cuyahoga Valley. The valley does have caves and deep ravines where a creature could potentially hide, and the river system could theoretically allow something to move long distances without being seen. The shed skin that was found is particularly frustrating from a research standpoint. If it had been preserved and analyzed, it could have provided definitive answers about what species of snake was in Peninsula. But remember, this was 1944. DNA analysis didn't exist, and local farmers weren't thinking about scientific documentation. They were thinking about protecting their livestock and families. The Peninsula Python case remains one of Ohio's most intriguing cryptid mysteries, precisely because it's so straightforward. No glowing eyes, no supernatural elements, just reports of a very large snake where no very large snake should be. Whether it was an escaped pet, a misidentified natural occurrence, or something truly unknown, it left its mark on Peninsula's history. Old-timers in the area still talk about the summer of 1944, when something massive slithered through the valley and then disappeared without a trace. Chapter 10. The Cedar Bog Monster. The Cedar Bog Monster, sometimes called the Wild Man of the Bog, is tied to one of Ohio's most unique natural features, Cedar Bog in Urbana. And before we dive into the creature itself, we need to talk about the bog, because this place is special. First off, despite the name, Cedar Bog isn't actually a bog. It's a fen, which is a type of wetland fed by groundwater rather than surface water. But more importantly, it's a relic of the last ice age. Cedar Bog has existed in some form for over 18,000 years, making it one of the oldest continuously existing ecosystems in Ohio. The water that feeds it is cold, staying at a constant temperature year-round, and this has allowed plant and animal species that typically exist much farther north to survive here, isolated from their main populations. The bog is home to rare orchids, carnivorous plants, and numerous species that shouldn't exist this far south. It's a genuinely otherworldly place, with boardwalks, winding through terrain that seems more suited to the Canadian wilderness than central Ohio. And according to local legend, it's also home to something else, something that predates modern human settlement in the area, something that the indigenous peoples of the region knew about long before European settlers arrived. The earliest written accounts of the Cedar Bog Monster come from the late 1800s, though oral traditions from the Shawnee and other tribes suggest the stories go back much further. The creature is described as a large, hairy, ape-like or human-like figure, standing between 7 and 9 feet tall, covered in matted reddish-brown or dark brown hair. Witnesses describe a powerful, unpleasant odor, like rotting vegetation mixed with wet animal fur, that often precedes sightings of the creature. But what really sets the Cedar Bog Monster apart is the mist. Multiple witnesses over the years have reported that encounters with the creature are preceded by the appearance of a thick, greenish-colored mist that seems to come out of nowhere. This mist rolls across the bog, low to the ground, and carries with it that distinctive smell. Then, through the mist, the creature appears. One of the most detailed accounts comes from 1968, when a group of biology students from a nearby college visited Cedar Bog on a field trip. They were studying the unique plant life when one of the students noticed the mist beginning to form. Their professor, an experienced botanist who'd worked at the bog for years, immediately became nervous and told the students they needed to leave. When the students questioned why, the professor reluctantly explained that the mist sometimes preceded sightings of something he couldn't explain. The students, being students, decided they wanted to wait and see what happened. As the mist thickened, they began to smell that characteristic odor. Then, about 50 yards away across the fen, they saw a figure emerge from the tree line. The creature was enormous, hunched but still standing taller than any human, moving through the shallow water of the bog with a slow, deliberate gait. It seemed to be searching for something, occasionally bending down to the water's surface. The students watched for several minutes, some of them trying to take photographs, though the mist made clear images nearly impossible. Then the creature, seeming to sense their presence, turned and looked directly at them. Even through the mist, and at that distance, they could see its eyes, which they described as very dark, almost black, with an intelligence that was deeply unsettling. The creature didn't approach them. Instead, it turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing into the underbrush. The mist began to dissipate almost immediately, as if it had only existed to herald the creature's presence. Park rangers and naturalists who work at Cedar Bog will tell you, usually off the record, that there's something in those woods that they can't quite explain. Tracks have been found, large bipedal prints that don't match any known animal. There have been vocalizations recorded, strange calls that sound somewhere between human and animal, that acoustics experts have been unable to identify. And then there's the mist, which appears with no meteorological explanation, seems to have that distinctive greenish tint, and is always accompanied by that smell. Skeptics offer several explanations. Cedar Bog's unique microclimate could create unusual mist formations, and the smell could be natural gases from decomposing plant matter in the fen. The creature itself could be misidentified bears, which do inhabit the area, or even people, poachers or trespassers who don't want to be seen. The vocalizations could be known animals, just distorted by the bog's unusual acoustics. But here's what gives me pause. Cedar Bog is not a large area. It's about 450 acres, well-studied, frequently visited by botanists and naturalists. If a bear or a person was responsible for these encounters, you'd expect more concrete evidence. You'd expect rangers and researchers to have definitively identified what's causing the sightings. And yet, after over a century of reports, there's still no satisfying explanation. Some researchers believe that if the Cedar Bog Monster is real, it might be using the bog as a refuge precisely because it's so isolated and unique. The cold water springs, the dense vegetation, the difficult terrain, all of this would make it an ideal hiding place for a creature trying to avoid human contact. The fact that the bog is a relic ecosystem, home to species that have existed there since the Ice Age, opens the interesting possibility that the creature itself could be a relict population of something that once existed across a much wider range. The greenish mist remains the most mysterious aspect of these encounters. Some theorize it could be the creature's way of marking territory, some kind of secretion or emission that creates the visual effect. Others think the mist might be a purely natural phenomenon that happens to occur in the same areas where the creature hunts or travels, making it seem connected when it's actually coincidental. Whatever the truth, the Cedar Bog Monster represents something important about cryptid lore. It's not just about the creature itself, but about the places these creatures are said to inhabit. Cedar Bog is a place that exists outside of normal time in a way, an Ice Age remnant where northern species still thrive, where the water runs cold even in summer, where mist forms without warning. It's exactly the kind of place where you'd expect something ancient and unknown to survive. Local residents in Urbana have a healthy respect for the bog and for the stories surrounding it. Some refuse to visit the area alone or after dark. Others dismiss the whole thing as superstition and folklore. But ask anyone who's lived in the area for decades, and they'll tell you they know someone who's seen something strange near Cedar Bog. They might not call it a monster. They might just say they saw something in the woods that didn't quite make sense. But the stories persist, passed down through generations, growing with each telling. Chapter 11. The Crosswick Monster. All right, we're going back in time now, way back to 1882, to a small community called Crosswick in Warren County. This is one of Ohio's oldest and most disturbing cryptid encounters, and it involves something that modern cryptozoology still can't quite categorize. We're talking about a 14-foot-long reptilian beast that tried to drag a child into a hollow tree. Yeah, this one's going to get dark. Crosswick in 1882 was a rural farming community, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and news traveled fast. On a summer day in July, a young boy, about 10 years old, was playing near the woods at the edge of his family's property. He was doing what kids did back then, exploring, maybe looking for interesting rocks or watching birds, just enjoying a day outside. What happened next would traumatize not just the boy, but the entire community. The boy heard something moving in the underbrush, a heavy, scraping sound. He turned to see what he later described as a monster emerging from a hollow tree. The creature was enormous, at least 14 feet long from head to tail, with a thick, muscular body covered in dark, leathery scales. Its head was elongated, almost crocodilian, but the proportions were all wrong. The legs were too long, too powerful, and it moved with a speed that reptiles that size shouldn't possess. Before the boy could react, the creature lunged at him. It grabbed him, not with its mouth, but with its front legs or arms. Witnesses would later disagree on exactly what to call them. The creature began dragging the screaming child back toward the hollow tree from which it had emerged. The boy fought, kicking and screaming, grabbing at grass and roots, anything to slow the creature down. His screams brought help. His father and several neighbors working in nearby fields heard the commotion and came running. What they saw was something out of a nightmare. This massive reptilian beast, unlike anything they'd ever encountered, dragging the boy across the ground toward a massive hollow oak tree at the edge of the woods. The men didn't hesitate. They grabbed whatever they had on hand, pitchforks, axes, shovels, and they charged the creature. The beast, seeing multiple adult humans approaching with weapons, released the boy and turned to face them. For a moment, there was a standoff. The creature, its mouth open, showing rows of teeth, hissing or making some kind of guttural sound, faced down half a dozen armed farmers. Then the creature did something unexpected. It retreated, but not into the woods like you might expect from a wild animal. It backed into that hollow tree, disappearing into the darkness within. The men reached the tree and looked inside, shining lanterns into the cavity. The tree was hollow all the way down, deeper than they could see, and there was no sign of the creature. The boy was badly scratched and bruised from being dragged across the ground, but otherwise physically unharmed. Mentally, though, he was traumatized. He refused to go near the woods for years afterward. His description of the creature was consistent every time he was asked. Long, reptilian, with scales like a snake, but legs like a lizard, bigger than any animal he'd ever seen, And those eyes, yellow with vertical pupils, looking at him with what he swore was intelligence. The men returned with more help, more weapons, and more lights. They were determined to find and kill whatever had attacked the child. They cut into the hollow tree, trying to reach the bottom of the cavity. What they found was a network of tunnels, old root systems, and natural passages that led deep underground. They followed as far as they could, but the passages became too narrow and dangerous. Whatever had been in that tree, it was long gone. Word spread throughout Warren County. Hunting parties were organized. The woods around Crosswick were searched extensively. Other farmers reported livestock gone missing in the weeks prior, chickens, goats, even a calf, but everyone had assumed it was coyotes or wild dogs. Now they weren't so sure. There were a few other reported sightings over the next several weeks. A farmer claimed he saw something large and reptilian moving through his cornfield at dusk. Another resident reported hearing strange hissing and scraping sounds coming from the woods at night. But no one else had a close encounter like the boys' attack, and by fall, the sightings stopped entirely. So, what was the Crosswick Monster? The most obvious comparison is to a large lizard or monitor species, but 14 feet is massive, larger than any monitor lizard native to North America. Alligators can reach those lengths, but in 1882, there were no alligators in Ohio, and the description doesn't match an alligator anyway. Plus, alligators don't typically try to drag prey into trees. Some researchers have suggested it could have been a surviving population of some prehistoric reptile, a relict, species that managed to exist in isolated pockets. The tunnel system discovered beneath the hollow tree adds credibility to the idea that something could live underground, emerging only occasionally to hunt. Ohio does have extensive cave systems and underground waterways that could theoretically support hidden populations of animals. The more skeptical explanation is that the boy was attacked by a large dog, or possibly a bear, and in his terror, his mind transformed what he saw into something more monstrous. The problem with that theory is the other witnesses. Multiple grown men, experienced farmers who knew the local wildlife, saw this creature. They described it consistently as reptilian, not mammalian. These were people who could tell the difference between a bear and something else entirely. There's also the detail about the hollow tree and the tunnel system. That's very specific and very strange. If this was just a frightened child misidentifying an animal, why would the men find those extensive underground passages? Why would the creature retreat into them rather than simply running into the woods? The Crosswick Monster case was widely reported in local newspapers at the time. The Cincinnati Enquirer ran a story about it, and it was discussed in several Ohio papers. This wasn't just local folklore that got written down decades later. This was documented as it happened, with multiple witnesses going on record. The incident left a lasting mark on Crosswick. That hollow tree became a local landmark, a place people avoided, especially after dark. Parents used the story to keep their children from wandering into the woods alone. And every so often, someone would report seeing something strange near those woods, though never again with the detail and terror of that July day in 1882. The Crosswick Monster represents something important in Ohio's cryptid history. It's one of the earliest well-documented encounters, and it involves a type of creature, a large, reptilian predator that doesn't fit neatly into any known category. Whether it was a genuine unknown species, a misidentified known animal, or something that defies easy explanation, it remains one of the most disturbing cryptid encounters in Ohio's history. Chapter 12. Orange Eyes. Time to talk about a legend that's part cryptid, part ghost story, and entirely terrifying. Orange Eyes, or as it's sometimes called, the Mansfield Horror, is connected to a specific location, an old lover's lane near the Ruggles Road area, just outside Mansfield in Richland County. And this isn't your typical cryptid story where you might catch a glimpse of something strange, and then it disappears. This is about a creature that seems to actively hunt people, particularly young couples who make the mistake of parking in the wrong place at the wrong time. The basic legend goes like this. There's a spot along an old, abandoned stretch of Ruggles Road, surrounded by dense forest, where couples used to park back in the 1960s and 70s. It was secluded, private, the kind of place teenagers went when they wanted to be alone. But something lived in those woods, something that didn't appreciate visitors. And that something had eyes that glowed brilliant orange, visible from hundreds of feet away through the darkness. The first widely reported encounter happened in the early 1960s. A young couple had driven out to the area, parked their car, and were talking when they noticed two orange lights in the woods. At first, they thought it might be someone with a flashlight, maybe another car's headlights reflecting off something. But the lights didn't move like flashlights. They just hung there in the darkness, steady and unblinking. Then the lights started getting closer. The couple watched, growing increasingly nervous as these two brilliant orange orbs moved through the forest toward their car. They could hear something moving through the underbrush now, heavy footfalls, branches breaking, and they could hear breathing, deep and raspy, like whatever was approaching had just run a long distance. The lights, the eyes, got close enough that in the glow from the car's interior light, they could see something of the creature's shape. Massive, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair or fur, with a build that suggested incredible strength. But it was those eyes that really got to them. They didn't just reflect light like animal eyes do. They emitted their own orange glow, bright enough to illuminate the creature's face, which witnesses described as somewhere between ape and human, but not quite either. The couple, showing more sense than many people in these situations, started their car and got out of there. As they drove away, they could see those orange eyes in their rearview mirror, still watching them from the edge of the woods. Both reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, a primal fear that stayed with them long after they'd reached safety. Word spread through the high school and the local teenage community, as these things do. And instead of keeping people away, it made the location more popular. Because teenagers, as we've established, make questionable decisions. Couples would drive out to Ruggles Road, specifically hoping to see orange eyes, turning it into a sort of dare or rite of passage. Many of them got more than they bargained for. Throughout the 1960s and into the 70s, there were dozens of reported encounters. The pattern was always similar. Couples would park, the orange lights would appear in the woods, and something large and powerful would approach the car. Some witnesses reported the creature actually reaching the car, pressing against the windows, rocking the vehicle. Others reported it circling the car, those eyes always visible, always watching. What made orange eyes particularly terrifying was the apparent intelligence it displayed. This wasn't just a curious animal investigating something new in its territory. Witnesses described feeling like they were being hunted, like the creature was deliberately terrorizing them. It would appear suddenly, cutting off their escape route. It would pace back and forth, as if deciding whether to attack. And it seemed to understand. that cars offered protection because it would often attempt to prevent people from reaching their vehicles. One particularly frightening encounter from 1972 involved a couple whose car broke down on Ruggles Road. They were trying to fix it when they saw the orange eyes appear. The creature approached, and they locked themselves in the car. For over an hour, they sat there while orange eyes circled the vehicle, occasionally striking it hard enough to rock it on its suspension. The man tried to start the car multiple times, but it wouldn't turn over. Finally, as dawn began to break, the orange eyes retreated into the woods, and the car mysteriously started on the first try. Local police were called to the area numerous times during this period. Officers would patrol Ruggles Road, responding to panicked calls from teenagers who'd encountered something in the woods. While most officers were skeptical, treating these as overactive imaginations or pranks, a few had their own encounters. One deputy reported seeing the orange eyes himself while investigating a call. He described them as unlike anything he'd seen from a known animal, too bright, too steady, and too far apart to be a normal creature's eyes. By the late 1970s, sightings began to decrease. The area became less popular as a lover's lane, partly because of the legend and partly because development in the area made it less secluded. But even today, people occasionally report seeing strange orange lights in the woods near the old Ruggles Road area. Hikers and hunters sometimes report an overwhelming feeling of being watched, and those distinctive orange eyes have been spotted on security cameras from nearby properties, though the footage is always too grainy or distant to show anything definitive. So what is orange eyes? The description, a large, hair-covered bipedal creature, suggests some relation to the Grassman or other Bigfoot-type cryptids. But the eyes are what set it apart. Most Bigfoot reports describe eyes that reflect light, glowing red or yellow in flashlight beams or headlights. Orange eyes actively glows, producing its own light, and that brilliant orange color is unusual in cryptid reports. Some researchers have suggested orange eyes might be a different species entirely, or perhaps a unique individual with some kind of bioluminescence. Others think it could be a supernatural entity rather than a flesh and blood creature, given the way it seems to appear and disappear, and the intense psychological effect it has on witnesses. The skeptical explanation is that orange eyes is purely psychological, a legend that became self-fulfilling. Teenagers expecting to see something scary would interpret any light or sound as the creature, creating a feedback loop of reported sightings. The problem with that explanation is the consistency of the reports and the fact that some witnesses, including law enforcement, weren't expecting to see anything and were genuinely frightened by their encounters. Orange eyes remains one of Mansfield's most enduring legends. The old Ruggles Road area still has a reputation, and locals will tell you that some places just feel wrong, feel dangerous, regardless of whether you believe in cryptids or not. And on dark nights, people still occasionally report seeing two brilliant orange lights in the woods, watching, waiting, just like they did over 60 years ago. Chapter 13. The Green-Clawed Beast. Let's head to the Ohio River, because Ohio's cryptids aren't limited to land and lakes. We need to talk about one of the most terrifying aquatic encounters in the state's history, the Green-Clawed Beast. This is the story of a woman who went for a swim and nearly didn't come back up, dragged down by something with claws that witnesses described as bright green and very, very sharp. It's the summer of 1955, and we're near the small community of Evanston, right on the Ohio River. The river was a popular spot for swimming back then, though people today might think twice about jumping in, given what we know about water quality. But in 1955, on a hot summer day, the cool water of the river was the place to be. A woman named Mrs. Darwin Johnson was swimming near the shore, in an area where the water was only about 4 or 5 feet deep. She was a strong swimmer, had grown up near the river, knew it well. She was just enjoying a leisurely swim when she felt something grab her leg. Not like getting tangled in a fishing line or caught on a submerged log, but grabbed by something with fingers or claws that dug into her flesh. Mrs. Johnson tried to pull away, but whatever had her was strong. She felt herself being pulled down, dragged under the water. She fought, kicking and thrashing, trying to reach the surface. She managed to get her head above water long enough to scream for help before being pulled under again. Her friends on the shore saw her struggling and immediately realized something was wrong. One of them, a man who was also a strong swimmer, dove in to help. When he reached Mrs. Johnson, he could see something in the murky water, something large and dark, holding on to her leg. He grabbed her arms and pulled, engaging in a literal tug of war with whatever had her. The creature, and that's what everyone involved would later insist it was, a creature, not a fish or an animal they could identify, suddenly let go. Mrs. Johnson was pulled to safety, and her rescuer got a glimpse of something moving away through the water. He described it as roughly human-shaped, but moving too fast and too smoothly to be a person. And he saw the hands, or claws, bright green, clearly visible even in the murky river water. Mrs. Johnson was dragged onto the shore, conscious but in shock. Her leg was badly scratched, deep gouges that clearly came from something with claws or very sharp nails. The scratches were arranged in a pattern that suggested a hand-like appendage, with marks from what appeared to be 4 digits, not 5 like a human hand, but 4 long fingers or claws. And here's the disturbing detail. The scratches had a strange greenish tint to them, as if whatever had made them had left some kind of residue behind. She was taken to the local doctor, who treated the wounds. The doctor, a man who'd practiced medicine in the area for decades, was puzzled by the injuries. The wounds didn't match anything he'd seen from river, accidents, from boat propellers, from fish, or from any known river hazard. The pattern was too deliberate, too controlled. And that green discoloration, he'd never seen anything like it. Word of the attack spread quickly through the community. Other swimmers came forward with their own stories, things they'd dismissed or not reported before. One man said he'd felt something grab his foot while swimming a few weeks earlier, but he'd managed to kick free. A woman reported seeing a large, dark shape in the water that moved against the current with what seemed like purposeful swimming. Children playing in shallow water reported feeling like something was watching them from deeper areas. The local newspaper ran the story, and it caught regional attention. "Woman attacked by river monster," read one headline. Investigators, mostly local volunteers and amateur naturalists, tried to determine what could have attacked Mrs. Johnson. They considered and ruled out various possibilities. Snapping, turtles, which can have sharp claws, but the pattern didn't match and snappers don't typically attack swimmers. Muskellunge, or other large fish, but fish don't have claws or hand-like appendages. A person, but the strength required to drag a grown woman underwater, and the underwater mobility ruled that out. Mrs. Johnson herself was adamant about what she felt. She'd been grabbed by something with a hand, not a mouth or a fin, but digits that wrapped around her leg. She felt the claws pierce her skin. And in that brief moment when she was underwater being dragged down, She saw it. She described something that was humanoid in shape, with a torso, arms, and what appeared to be legs, though she couldn't see them clearly. The skin was dark, almost black or very dark green, and smooth, not scaly, but not like human skin either. And the face, in the murky water, she couldn't see details, but she got an impression of something that wasn't quite human, with eyes that seemed too large and a mouth that was all wrong. In the days following the attack, the area of the river where it occurred was avoided by swimmers. Some brave or foolish individuals went looking for the creature, diving with spear guns or trying to lure it out. Nothing was found. The creature, if it was still in the area, stayed hidden. The green-clawed beast, as it came to be known, was reported sporadically over the following years. In 1959, 2 fishermen reported seeing something with a humanoid shape surface briefly near their boat before diving back down. In 1963, a child claimed something tried to grab him while he was wading, but he made it to shore before it could get a good hold. Each report mentioned the same features: the vaguely human shape, the incredible strength, and those distinctive green claws. Cryptozoologists have speculated that the green-clawed beast might be related to other aquatic humanoid reports from around the country. Similar creatures have been reported in various rivers and lakes, often described as having amphibian or reptilian characteristics combined with a humanoid body plan. Some researchers have suggested these could be an unknown species of large salamander or amphibian that has evolved traits that make it appear more human-like than we'd expect. The green color of the claws is particularly interesting. Some aquatic creatures do have green coloration due to algae growth or diet, but claws that leave a green residue in wounds? That's unusual. It suggests either some kind of secretion, possibly venomous or toxic, or perhaps the claws themselves are composed of some material that breaks down into the wound. Mrs. Johnson carried the scars from her encounter for the rest of her life. She never went back in the Ohio River. She never doubted what had grabbed her that day. And when people would ask her about it, she'd show them the scars and simply say, "There's something in that river that shouldn't be there." The green-clawed beast remains one of Ohio's most frightening cryptids because of how viscerally terrifying the encounter was. This wasn't seeing something at a distance and wondering what it was. This was being attacked, being pulled underwater, feeling those claws dig into your flesh. It's the kind of encounter that leaves no room for doubt in the victim's mind, regardless of what skeptics might say. Chapter 14. The Pukwudgie. Now we're going to dive into something a bit different, a cryptid that comes from Native American folklore, but is still reportedly seen in Ohio today. Meet the Pukwudgie, small, mischievous, incredibly dangerous humanoid creatures that, according to legend, have inhabited this land far longer than any European settler. And if you think small means harmless, you're in for a surprise, because these things are allegedly responsible for deaths, disappearances, and more than a few people wandering out of the woods with no memory of how they got there. The Pukwudgie comes from the folklore of various Native American tribes, particularly the Wampanoag people of the Northeast, but versions of these creatures appear in the traditions of many tribes, including those that historically inhabited Ohio. The name roughly translates to person of the wilderness, or little wild man of the woods. They're described as standing between 2 and 3 feet tall, roughly humanoid, in shape, but with exaggerated features, large noses, oversized ears, and fingers that end in sharp points. But here's where it gets weird. Some descriptions say Pukwudgies are covered in short gray hair that resembles porcupine quills. Others describe them as having smooth, grayish skin. Some say they glow faintly in darkness. The inconsistency in descriptions might be because there are different types of Pukwudgies, or it might be because these creatures are, according to legend, shapeshifters capable of changing their appearance. In Ohio, Pukwudgie sightings are concentrated around ancient Native American sites, particularly near the Serpent Mound in Adams County. Serpent Mound is a mysterious effigy mound built by indigenous peoples, possibly between 300 BCE and 1000 CE. It's a sacred site, an archaeological treasure, and according to locals, a place where the veil between our world and something else is thinner than it should be. Visitors to Serpent Mound and the surrounding area have reported encounters with small humanoid figures for decades. These aren't your cute fairy tale creatures. Witnesses describe feeling an overwhelming sense of dread when they spot Pukwudgies. The creatures are often seen at dusk or dawn, moving through the woods with unnatural speed. They disappear and reappear, making it nearly impossible to track their movement. One common report involves hikers on trails near ancient mound sites who feel like they're being followed or watched. They'll catch glimpses of small figures darting between trees, always just at the edge of their vision. Some people report hearing voices, whispers in a language they don't understand, or laughter that sounds malicious and mocking. Others report objects going missing from their backpacks, only to reappear later in impossible locations. But Pukwudgies aren't just tricksters. According to Native American tradition and modern reports, they're dangerous. They're said to be able to create fire from nothing, to shoot invisible arrows that cause pain or illness, and to lure people off trails and into dangerous areas where they become lost or injured. Some legends say Pukwudgies can possess people, controlling their actions. Others say they can create illusions, making people see things that aren't there, or miss things that are. There's a particularly disturbing account from the late 1990s involving a group of teenagers who decided to camp near one of the smaller mounds in southern Ohio. They set up their camp as the sun was setting and built a fire. As darkness fell, they started hearing sounds from the woods around them, footsteps, whispers, and what sounded like small objects being thrown at their tent. One of the teenagers claimed to see a small figure standing just outside the ring of firelight, watching them. When he shined his flashlight toward it, the figure was gone. Throughout the night, they had the sense of being surrounded, of multiple small beings moving around their campsite, just beyond what they could see. In the morning, they found their supplies had been tampered with. Food was missing from sealed containers. Their car keys, which had been in a zippered pocket of a backpack, were found hanging from a tree branch 20 feet away. Most disturbing, one member of the group couldn't remember anything from the night before. His last memory was sitting by the fire, and his next memory was waking up in his sleeping bag in the morning. The other said he'd been there all night, but he'd been acting strange, speaking in a voice that didn't sound like his own, saying things that didn't make sense. Park rangers and people who work at Serpent Mound and other ancient sites in Ohio will tell you, usually quietly and only if they trust you, that strange things happen in these places. Equipment malfunctions for no reason. People become disoriented on trails they've walked hundreds of times. There are spots where animals refuse to go, where plants grow in strange patterns, where the air feels different. One ranger I came across in my research, who worked at a site near Serpent Mound for over 20 years, said he'd seen the Pukwudgies 3 times. Small grayish figures, no more than 3 feet tall, watching from the woods. He said the first time he saw one, he thought it was a child who'd wandered from their parents. He called out, tried to approach, and the figure just vanished, not ran away, vanished. He checked the area where it had been standing and found small, human-like footprints in the dirt. But they stopped abruptly, as if whatever made them had simply ceased to exist. From a cryptozoological standpoint, Pukwudgies are fascinating because they blur the line between folklore and flesh and blood creatures. Are they undiscovered primates? Some kind of unknown small hominid that has learned to avoid human contact? That doesn't explain the reported supernatural abilities, the vanishing, the possession, the fire starting, unless those aspects are embellishments added to encounters with something more mundane. Or are Pukwudgies something else entirely? Some researchers in paranormal fields suggest they might be interdimensional beings, entities that exist alongside our reality, but occasionally cross over, especially in places of spiritual or historical significance like the ancient mounds. That would explain why they seem to appear and disappear, why they're associated with specific locations, and why encounters with them feel different from encounters with normal flesh and blood animals. The skeptical explanation is that Pukwudgies are purely folklore, stories passed down through generations that people interpret as real when they have perfectly ordinary experiences in the woods. Strange sounds are just wildlife. Feelings of being watched are just our primitive brains being overly cautious, and glimpses of small figures are misidentified animals, or even just shadows and light playing tricks. But talk to people who've had encounters, particularly those who grew up hearing Native American traditions about Pukwudgies, and they'll tell you these creatures are very real. They'll tell you that some places in Ohio have always been inhabited by things that humans don't fully understand. And they'll advise you, quite seriously, to show respect when visiting ancient sites, to leave offerings if you know the traditions, and to get out of the woods before dark. The Pukwudgie serves as a reminder that Ohio's cryptid landscape includes more than just large physical creatures. It includes beings from folklore and legend that refuse to stay safely in the past, that continue to be reported by modern witnesses, and that challenge our understanding of what's possible in the natural world. Chapter 15. The Gallipolis Wild Man. We need to go way back in Ohio's history, all the way to 1869, for what might be one of the earliest documented Bigfoot encounters in American history. This is the story of the Gallipolis Wild Man, and it's important for 2 reasons. First, it occurred decades before the term Bigfoot was even coined, meaning the witnesses weren't influenced by modern cryptid culture. Second, this wasn't just a sighting. This was an attack, a violent confrontation that left physical evidence and terrified witnesses. Gallipolis in 1869 was a small river town on the Ohio River, settled primarily by French immigrants in the late 1700s. It was a civilized place with schools, churches, and businesses, not some wild frontier outpost. So when something attacked a carriage on a well-traveled road near the town, it sent shockwaves through the community. The incident occurred on a summer evening. A family, the Shoemakers, were traveling by carriage along a road that ran through a wooded area just outside Gallipolis. It was late afternoon, still light out, which makes this case particularly interesting because most Bigfoot encounters happen at night or in low-light conditions. The Shoemakers included the father, mother, and their 2 children, and they were simply making the trip back home from visiting relatives in town. As they entered a particularly dense section of woods, their horse suddenly became agitated. Horses, for all their size, are prey animals and have excellent instincts for danger. This horse started showing signs of panic, trying to bolt despite the driver's attempts to calm it. Then they saw why. Emerging from the tree line was what witnesses described as a wild man, a creature that stood upright like a human but was clearly not human. The figure was massive, estimated at 7 to 8 feet tall, with a powerful, broad-shouldered build. It was entirely covered in dark, matted hair, so thick that it was impossible to see the skin beneath. The face, what they could see of it, was described as brutish and ape-like, with a flat nose, heavy brow ridge, and a mouth that seemed too wide. The creature didn't run away from the carriage as a normal animal might. Instead, it approached, and then it attacked. The creature grabbed the side of the carriage, actually gripped it with what appeared to be hands rather than paws, and began shaking it violently. Mrs. Shoemaker screamed. The children were crying. Mr. Shoemaker tried to control the panicking horse while also attempting to fend off this creature with his driving whip. The wild man, showing remarkable strength, actually succeeded in tipping the carriage onto 2 wheels. The family genuinely believed they were about to be overturned. Mr. Shoemaker, in desperation, managed to strike the creature several times with his whip. Whether the blows hurt it or simply annoyed it enough to make it lose interest, the creature released the carriage and let out what witnesses described as a horrible scream, somewhere between human and animal, a sound of rage or frustration. The family didn't wait around to see what the creature would do next. They got that terrified horse moving and fled the area at top speed. As they looked back, they could see the wild man standing in the middle of the road, watching them leave. They went straight to the authorities in Gallipolis. At first, officials were skeptical, thinking perhaps the family had encountered a vagrant or maybe a disturbed person living in the woods. But when they examined the carriage, they found damage consistent with the story. Deep gouges in the wood where something with incredible strength had gripped it. And even more compelling, they found hair, thick, coarse hair that didn't match any animal the locals could identify. A search party was organized the next day. Dozens of men, some armed, went into the woods where the encounter had occurred. They found evidence that something large had been in the area. Trees were found with bark stripped off at heights of 7 to 8 feet. Large, human-like footprints were discovered in soft earth near a creek, prints that measured over a foot long and showed clear toe impressions. And they found what appeared to be a bedding area, a section of flattened vegetation where something large had apparently been sleeping. But they never found the wild man itself. The creature, if it was still in the area, had hidden too well or moved on. The search continued for several days, but eventually people returned to their normal lives, though many were now more cautious when traveling through wooded areas. What makes the Gallipolis wild man case historically significant is the timing. This was 1869, decades before the Patterson-Gimlin film, before the term Bigfoot entered popular culture, before Sasquatch became a household name. The Shoemaker family had no cultural reference for what they'd encountered. They simply described what they saw, a large, hair-covered, man-like creature that attacked their carriage. The local newspaper, the Gallia Times, covered the story extensively. It wasn't treated as a joke or dismissed as fantasy. The reporters investigated seriously, interviewed witnesses, examined the physical evidence. This was reported as a genuine, unexplained event, something that required attention and investigation. There were follow-up sightings in the Gallipolis area over the next few years. Farmers reported seeing a large, hair-covered figure watching them from tree lines. Hunters claimed to have heard strange vocalizations in the woods, howls and screams that didn't match any known animal. And there were more reports of livestock going missing or being found killed in ways that suggested something much larger than a coyote or even a bear. By the mid-1870s, the sightings tapered off, and the Gallipolis wild man faded from immediate memory, though it remained part of local folklore. It wasn't until the modern Bigfoot phenomenon began in the mid-20th century that researchers looked back at historical accounts like this one and realized Ohio had been reporting these creatures for over a century. From a cryptozoological standpoint, the Gallipolis case is valuable precisely because it predates the modern Bigfoot phenomenon. The witnesses weren't influenced by popular media or existing expectations about what a Bigfoot should look like. They simply reported what they experienced, and their description aligns remarkably well with thousands of modern Bigfoot reports: the height, the build, the hair coverage, the apparent strength, the bipedal locomotion, even the aggressive territorial behavior. Skeptics might argue that the family encountered a bear, which can stand on hind legs and might appear human-like in silhouette. But the description doesn't match bear behavior or anatomy. Bears don't typically attack moving carriages. They don't grip objects with human-like hands, and the footprints found didn't match bear tracks. The Gallipolis wild man represents an important piece of Ohio's cryptid history and American cryptozoology in general. It shows that reports of large, bipedal, hair-covered hominids in North America go back much further than most people realize. And it raises the question, if people were seeing these creatures in 1869, before modern media could spread and influence such stories, what exactly were they seeing? Chapter 16. The Ohio River Sea Serpents. All right, let's get back on the water, but this time we're not talking about Lake Erie's Bessie. We're heading to the Ohio River for accounts of creatures that are distinct and in some ways even stranger than their lake-dwelling cousins. Throughout the 19th century, the Ohio River had its own series of sea serpent sightings, creatures described with long necks, horse-like heads, and the disturbing ability to swim upstream against powerful currents, something that shouldn't be physically possible for the creatures people were describing. The Ohio River in the 1800s was the lifeline of the region, a major transportation route for goods and people. Riverboat captains, ferrymen, and crew members spent their entire lives on that water. They knew every bend of the river, every sandbar, every type of fish and waterfowl. So when multiple experienced rivermen started reporting encounters with massive serpentine creatures that defied explanation, people paid attention. The first well-documented sighting occurred in 1829. A riverboat captain named Harrison Taylor was piloting his vessel between Portsmouth and Maysville when he and his crew spotted something in the water ahead. At first, they thought it might be a log or debris floating downstream, but as they got closer, they realized it was moving against the current. The object, which they soon realized was a living creature, had a long neck rising about 4 feet above the water's surface. The head, according to Captain Taylor's account, resembled a horse's head, but larger and with a more elongated snout. The creature seemed to notice the approaching boat and dove beneath the surface. The crew got a brief glimpse of the body as it submerged, describing it as serpentine, at least 30 to 40 feet long, dark in color, with what might have been a ridge or fin running along its back. What shocked Captain Taylor was the power and speed with which the creature moved. It shot through the water, leaving a wake that rocked his boat, despite the creature having just dove from the surface. This sighting was reported in several newspapers along the river, and it opened the floodgates for other witnesses to come forward with their own encounters. A ferryman near Wheeling reported seeing a similar creature in 1833. He described watching it for nearly 10 minutes as it swam back and forth across the river, its long neck rising and falling, occasionally dipping its head into the water as if feeding. What made these sightings particularly credible was the consistency across multiple witnesses who had no contact with each other. The descriptions matched remarkably well: a serpentine body, dark coloration, a long neck, a horse-like head, powerful swimming ability, and that strange behavior of moving against the current, which shouldn't be possible for a creature of that size and shape given the power of the Ohio River's flow. In 1845, there was an incident that nearly turned tragic. A family was crossing the river on a small ferry when something large struck the boat from below. The impact was strong enough to crack several boards and start the boat taking on water. As the ferryman frantically tried to steer toward shore, passengers reported seeing a long, serpentine body surface briefly alongside the boat. One witness described seeing the head emerge and said the creature seemed to be investigating the boat, almost curious about it. They made it to shore safely, and an examination of the boat showed damage consistent with being struck by something large and hard, possibly the creature's head or body. There were also strange markings on the hull, scratches or abrasions that didn't match anything the ferryman had seen in his years of river work. Throughout the mid to late 1800s, reports continued. Fishermen would occasionally encounter these creatures, seeing them surface in the distance or finding their nets damaged by something far too large and powerful to be a fish. In several cases, witnesses reported the creatures appearing to hunt, moving through the water with purpose, occasionally striking at fish or other prey. One particularly detailed sighting from 1867 involved multiple witnesses on the shore near Cincinnati. A group of people were watching the river when they spotted something that appeared to be two creatures, possibly a mating pair or a parent with offspring. The larger creature had its head and neck above water, while a smaller one, perhaps half the size, swam nearby. Witnesses watched for over half an hour as the creatures moved upstream, seemingly unbothered by the current that would challenge most river animals. So, what were these Ohio River serpents? The obvious comparison is to plesiosaurs, those long-necked marine reptiles from the dinosaur age. The descriptions certainly match what we imagine a plesiosaur might look like: the long neck, the body plan, even the supposed fin or ridge. But plesiosaurs went extinct millions of years ago, and the idea of a breeding population surviving undetected into the 1800s in a river as heavily trafficked as the Ohio stretches credibility. Could they have been giant eels? Eels can grow quite large, and they're certainly serpentine. But even the largest eels don't have long necks and horse-like heads. They also don't swim with their heads raised above water the way these creatures were consistently described. Some researchers have suggested they might have been large sturgeon, which do live in the Ohio River and can reach impressive sizes. Sturgeon have elongated snouts that, from a distance or in poor visibility, might resemble a long neck. But the behavior doesn't match. Sturgeon don't swim with their heads above water, and the size estimates from witnesses far exceed even the largest sturgeon. There's also the possibility of misidentification of known animals in unusual circumstances. River currents can create strange visual effects. Floating, debris, groups of fish, or waterfowl in formation might, under the right conditions, appear serpentine. But this explanation falls apart when you have experienced rivermen, people who spent their lives on the water, insisting they saw living creatures unlike anything else in the river. The most intriguing aspect of the Ohio River serpent reports is that they stopped relatively abruptly by the early 1900s. As the river became more industrialized, more polluted, and more heavily trafficked, the sightings ceased. Some cryptozoologists suggest this is because whatever these creatures were, they couldn't survive the changing conditions. Others think increased human activity drove them away to more remote waterways, or that they died out entirely. Occasionally, even in modern times, there are reports of something unusual in the Ohio River. In 2005, a fisherman near Madison, Indiana, reported seeing something with a long neck surface briefly before diving. In 2013, a family on a recreational boat reported an encounter with something large moving beneath their vessel in a section of river near Portsmouth. But these modern sightings are rare, nothing like the regular reports from the 1800s. The Ohio River sea serpents represent a fascinating chapter in Ohio's cryptid history. They were reported consistently throughout an entire century by credible witnesses, documented in newspapers and ship logs, and yet they remain unexplained. Whether they were real creatures, misidentifications, or something else entirely, they captured the imagination of everyone who lived and worked along the river, adding a sense of mystery to what was otherwise a well-known and well-traveled waterway. Chapter 17. The Butler County Gargoyle. Time to talk about one of Ohio's more unusual and frankly bizarre cryptids, the Butler County Gargoyle. This isn't your typical hairy hominid or lake monster. This is something that looks like it flew straight out of a medieval cathedral, a gray, winged humanoid with a head that witnesses described as looking like it was wearing a bicycle helmet. Yeah, you read that right. A bicycle helmet. Sometimes cryptids are just weird, folks. The primary sighting of the Butler County Gargoyle occurred in the early 1990s, specifically in the summer of 1992, along a rural road between Hamilton and Fairfield. A couple was driving home late at night, around 11 p.m., when they spotted something unusual on the side of the road ahead. At first, in their headlights, it looked like a person crouched down, maybe someone having car trouble or something wrong. As they got closer and slowed down, they realized this was no person. The figure was crouched on the roadside, but its proportions were all wrong. It was too large, too bulky. And then it turned to look at them, and they got a clear view in their headlights. The creature was roughly human-sized, maybe 6 feet tall, but much more muscular and bulky than a person. Its skin, if you could call it that, was a uniform gray color, almost like stone. But what really caught their attention were 2 features. First, wings. Large bat-like wings were folded against its back, clearly visible even in its crouched position. Second, the head. The head had a strange, rounded shape that both witnesses independently described as looking like it was wearing a bicycle helmet, smooth and curved, with a slight ridge running front to back. The creature's face, what they could see of it, was flattened with large, dark eyes that reflected their headlights like an animal's eyes. It had a small nose, barely more than 2 slits, and a mouth that seemed too wide, cutting across the lower portion of the face in a way that wasn't quite right. The couple sat there, frozen, for what they estimated was 10 to 15 seconds, though in situations like this, time perception goes out the window. The creature stared back at them, seemingly as startled by the encounter as they were. Then, in a movement they both described as remarkably fluid and fast, the creature unfurled those wings, pushed off from the ground, and flew away. Not jumped away, not ran into the woods. Flew. They watched as it gained altitude quickly, wings beating with powerful strokes, and disappeared into the darkness above the tree line. The whole encounter, from spotting it on the roadside to watching it fly away, lasted less than 30 seconds. The couple, understandably shaken, drove home and immediately called the Butler County Sheriff's Office. Deputies took their report, and to their credit, took it seriously enough to send an officer out to the area where the sighting occurred. The officer found nothing, no tracks, no physical evidence, but noted that the couple seemed genuinely frightened and were not intoxicated or under the influence of anything. Word of the sighting spread through the community, as these things do. Some people dismissed it as a hoax or a case of misidentification. Maybe they'd seen a large bird, a heron, or a sandhill crane, and in the darkness had misinterpreted what they saw. But the witnesses were adamant. They'd had a clear view in their headlights. The creature had been less than 30 feet away, and what they saw was no bird. What makes the Butler County gargoyle particularly interesting is that it doesn't fit neatly into other cryptid categories. It's not a Bigfoot-type creature, not an aquatic monster, not a traditional flying cryptid like Mothman. It's something unique, or at least uniquely described. The gray, stone-like appearance combined with the bat wings and that bizarre bicycle helmet head shape don't match any known animal or any other commonly reported cryptid. There have been a handful of other winged humanoid reports from Ohio over the years, but most describe creatures more similar to Mothman, dark coloring, red eyes, more traditionally bat or moth-like proportions. The gargoyle stands apart with its specific features. Some researchers have suggested it might be related to gargoyle legends from Europe, possibly brought over by immigrants and manifesting in sightings here. But that raises more questions than it answers. Are we talking about a real, physical creature that inspired gargoyle statues on medieval buildings? Or are we talking about something more paranormal, an entity that takes the form people expect based on cultural knowledge? The skeptical explanation is straightforward misidentification. Butler County has various large birds, herons, cranes, even the occasional eagle. In low light conditions, a large bird might appear more humanoid than it actually is, especially if witnesses only see it briefly. The wings are easily explained if it was a bird. The gray color could be a trick of the lighting. The bicycle helmet head might just be how witnesses interpreted the shape of a bird's head and beak from an unusual angle. But the couple who saw the gargoyle remained convinced of what they witnessed. In later interviews, they stuck to their description, never wavered, never admitted to uncertainty about what they'd seen. They described the way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes, the deliberate way it had looked at them before deciding to fly away. These weren't vague impressions or half-remembered details. This was a clear, close-up sighting that left them with no doubt they'd encountered something unusual. There were a few follow-up reports in the Butler County area over the next year or two. A farmer reported seeing something large and winged flying over his property at dawn. A couple of teenagers claimed to have seen a gray figure perched on a barn roof that flew away when they got close. But nothing matched the detail and proximity of that initial 1992 sighting. The Butler County gargoyle remains one of Ohio's most unusual cryptid reports. It doesn't have the long history of sightings that creatures like the Grassman or Bessie have, and it doesn't have the cultural staying power of Mothman. But for that one couple on a summer night in 1992, it was very real, very bizarre, and very unforgettable. And it serves as a reminder that Ohio's cryptid catalog includes creatures that defy easy categorization, things that are so strange they challenge our assumptions about what kinds of creatures could possibly exist. Chapter 18. The Mud Mermaids. All right, buckle up, because we're about to discuss one of the most bizarre and frankly unsettling cryptids in Ohio's history. The mud mermaids, sometimes called the Ohio River Sirens, were reported in the 19th century along various stretches of the Ohio River. And unlike the romantic image the term mermaid might conjure up, these creatures were anything but beautiful. We're talking about barking, reptilian humanoids that allegedly lived in hollow logs and had a taste for fish, garbage, and possibly worse. The primary reports of mud mermaids come from the 1800s, particularly between 1820 and 1880, from various communities along the Ohio River. The creatures were described as having humanoid upper bodies, with arms, hands, and something approximating a torso, but reptilian or amphibian features rather than mammalian ones. The skin was described as scaly or slimy, usually a muddy brown or green color that provided perfect camouflage against the riverbank. The lower body, instead of the fishtail you might expect from traditional mermaid lore, was described as either legless and slug-like, or in some accounts having short, stubby legs with webbed feet. The face was the truly nightmarish part, flat and broad, with a wide mouth filled with small, sharp teeth, large eyes that bulged slightly, and either no nose or just nostril slits. But here's what really sets mud mermaids apart from other cryptid accounts: the barking. Multiple witnesses over decades reported that these creatures made sounds described as similar to a dog's bark, but more guttural and aggressive. They would bark at each other, seemingly communicating, and would bark at humans who got too close, in what appeared to be territorial warnings. The most detailed account comes from 1858, documented in a Cincinnati newspaper. A group of men were fishing along the river near a section known for having numerous fallen trees and hollow logs that had washed up along the bank. The fishermen heard that distinctive barking sound and went to investigate, thinking perhaps someone's dog had gotten stuck or injured. What he found, according to his account, was a creature about 4 feet long, with a humanoid torso, arms, and head, but a lower body that was thick and slug-like. It was pulling itself out of a hollow log that was half submerged at the water's edge. The creature's skin was dark and appeared wet or slimy, and it had webbed hands with what looked like claws at the tips of each finger. The man froze, and the creature saw him. It opened its mouth, showing multiple rows of small, sharp teeth, and let out that barking sound, loud and aggressive. The man backed away slowly, and the creature watched him for a moment before pulling itself back into the hollow log and disappearing. The man's story was met with skepticism initially, but then other fishermen and rivermen in the area came forward with their own encounters. Several had seen similar creatures, always near hollow logs or in areas with dense debris along the riverbank. One riverboat crew reported seeing multiple mud mermaids, possibly 5 or 6 of them, pulling themselves onto a sandbar in the early morning. They watched through a telescope as the creatures seemed to be sunning themselves, lying still on the sand with just their heads raised, looking remarkably like large, grotesque seals. The creatures seemed to be primarily nocturnal or crepuscular, most active at dawn and dusk. They appeared to feed on fish, with several witnesses reporting seeing them catching fish in shallow water, using their hands in a surprisingly dexterous manner. There were also reports of them scavenging, eating dead fish and other organic matter that washed up along the river. What made mud mermaids particularly unsettling was their apparent intelligence and their territorial behavior. They seem to live in family groups or small colonies, occupying sections of riverbank and defending them aggressively against intruders, whether other mud mermaids or humans. Fishermen learned to avoid certain areas where the creatures were known to be active, because approaching their territory would provoke that aggressive barking, and, in some cases, the creatures would actually advance toward the intruders, pulling themselves across the ground with their arms in a disturbing, determined manner. There's one particularly dark story from 1870 involving a child who went missing near the river. The child's parents claimed they heard barking sounds from the direction their child had wandered, and when they found the child's clothes near a hollow log, they feared the worst. A search was organized, but the child was never found. Some locals blamed mud mermaids, claiming the creatures had taken the child, though there was never any proof. It's just as likely the child drowned in the river, a tragically common occurrence in that era. As the 1800s progressed and the Ohio River became more industrialized and polluted, reports of mud mermaids decreased. The last well-documented sighting was in 1889, when a fisherman near Portsmouth reported seeing one, though his account was brief and lacked the detail of earlier reports. After that, mud mermaids seem to have disappeared from the river, vanishing as mysteriously as they had been reported. So, what were mud mermaids? The description suggests something amphibian or reptilian, possibly a large, unknown species of salamander or some kind of aquatic reptile. Giant salamanders do exist in other parts of the world. The Chinese giant salamander and Japanese giant salamander can reach lengths of nearly 6 feet, and they do make vocalizations. Could mud mermaids have been an American species of giant salamander that went extinct or was simply never properly documented? The problem with that theory is the humanoid characteristics. The descriptions of arms, hands with fingers, and a torso that's more humanoid than salamander-like don't match any known amphibian. Some cryptozoologists have suggested mud mermaids might have been a species of aquatic ape or primate, possibly related to humans but adapted to a semi-aquatic lifestyle. That would explain the humanoid features, but it raises the question of how such a creature could have existed in Ohio without leaving more concrete evidence. The barking is another mystery. Some amphibians and reptiles do make vocalizations. Crocodiles and alligators bellow. Some frogs have calls that could be described as bark-like. But the descriptions from witnesses suggest something more complex: communication between individuals, territorial warnings, sounds that seem to have intent and meaning. Skeptics argue that mud mermaids were probably seals or river otters that had made their way up the Ohio River from the ocean. Seals can bark, and both seals and otters have been known to travel up rivers. From a distance or in poor lighting, they might appear more humanoid than they actually are. But witnesses who saw mud mermaids up close insisted these were not seals or otters. The body structure was wrong, the behavior was different, and the presence of hands with fingers didn't match either animal. The mud mermaids represent one of Ohio's most bizarre and unsettling cryptid mysteries. The consistency of the reports over decades, the specific details about their appearance and behavior, and the fact that multiple independent witnesses describe the same features all suggest that people were seeing something real, even if we can't identify what that something was. Whether they were an unknown species that went extinct, misidentified known animals, or something that defies current zoological classification, they left their mark on Ohio River folklore, a disturbing reminder that not all cryptids are majestic or awe-inspiring. Some are just deeply, profoundly weird. Chapter 19. The Storm Hag. Let's talk about one of Lake Erie's most haunting and potentially deadly legends. The Storm Hag, also known as the Witch of the Water, is said to dwell in the deepest, darkest parts of Lake Erie. Unlike most cryptids that are simply strange or frightening, the Storm Hag is associated with death, specifically the deaths of sailors and the sinking of ships. This is a creature tied to tragedy, to loss, and to the dangerous, unpredictable nature of one of America's Great Lakes. The legend of the Storm Hag goes back to the early days of commercial shipping on Lake Erie, back in the early 1800s. Sailors on the lake began reporting an eerie phenomenon. Before major storms, particularly the kinds of violent, sudden squalls that Lake Erie is famous for, some crew members would report hearing singing. Not just any singing, but a woman's voice, haunting and beautiful, coming from the water itself. The song was described as mesmerizing, almost hypnotic. Sailors who heard it reported feeling drawn to it, wanting to get closer to the source. Those who resisted the urge and warned their captains often found that within hours, sometimes within minutes, a violent storm would strike. And ships that had crew members who heard the singing but didn't take precautions, well, many of those ships didn't make it back to port. The Storm Hag herself is rarely seen, but the few descriptions we have are consistent and terrifying. She's said to appear as a gaunt, pale woman with long, dark hair that seems to float around her as if she's underwater, even when she's on the surface. Her eyes are the most distinctive feature, described as yellow or golden, glowing with their own internal light. Her mouth, when it opens to sing, shows too many teeth, all of them sharp, like a predator's. She rises from the depths before storms, her upper body visible above the water, and she sings her warning, or perhaps her invitation to sailors. Those who've seen her and survived describe an overwhelming feeling of dread, a certainty that death is approaching. Some say she points at specific ships, marking them for destruction. One of the most famous Storm Hag incidents occurred in November 1913, during what's known as the Great Storm, or the White Hurricane. This storm system devastated the Great Lakes, sinking numerous ships and killing hundreds of sailors. In the days before the storm hit, multiple vessels reported crew members hearing that haunting singing. Several captains, believing in the legend, immediately made for port despite good weather. Those ships survived. Others, whose captains dismissed the warnings as superstition, were lost when the storm struck. The crew of the James Carruthers, which sank during that storm with all hands lost, reportedly had a heated argument the day before. Some crew members insisted they'd heard the Storm Hag's song and wanted to seek shelter. The captain refused, saying they were behind schedule and the weather looked fine. The ship went down in Lake Huron, but before departing Lake Erie, a dock worker reported seeing a strange, pale woman standing on the pier, watching the ship leave, singing so quietly he could barely hear it. In 1958, a freighter captain named William Mueller had a direct encounter with the Storm Hag. His ship was traveling across Lake Erie on a clear day when he spotted something in the water ahead. Using binoculars, he saw what appeared to be a woman floating in the water. He ordered his ship to slow, thinking they'd found a victim of a boating accident. But as they got closer, he realized this was no accident victim. The woman, if that's what she was floating upright in the water, her body visible from the waist up. Her skin was corpse pale, her hair was black and spread around her on the surface of the water. And those eyes, golden and glowing, were staring directly at his ship. she opened her mouth and began to sing, and even over the sound of the ship's engines, the crew could hear it. A melody that Muller described as beautiful and horrible at the same time. Muller, who'd grown up on the lakes and knew the legends, immediately ordered his ship to change course and make for the nearest port at top speed. His crew thought he'd lost his mind. The weather was perfect, calm seas, clear skies. But Muller insisted, and as captain, his word was law. 3 hours later, a squall hit the area they would have been in if they'd maintained course. Winds over 70 miles per hour, waves reaching 25 feet. Several smaller vessels were damaged, and a fishing boat was lost with its entire crew. The storm hag isn't always seen. More often, it's just the song, rising from the water, eerie and compelling. Experienced Great Lakes sailors will tell you, especially the old-timers, that if you hear singing on the water and there's no obvious source, you find shelter immediately. You don't question it. You don't debate it. You just get off the water as fast as possible. Theories about what the storm hag actually is vary wildly. Some believe she's genuinely supernatural, a spirit or entity that feeds on drowning victims or perhaps tries to warn sailors out of some twisted sense of mercy. Others think she might be some kind of lake monster that has learned to associate certain weather conditions with feeding opportunities. The rough waters bring fish to the surface, and her singing is just some natural vocalization that happens to coincide with approaching storms. There's also a more mundane explanation. Lake Erie is known for its unpredictable weather. Experienced sailors can often sense approaching storms through subtle changes in air pressure, wind patterns, and water conditions. The singing might be an auditory phenomenon caused by wind over water, or even a form of mass hysteria where sailors, expecting to hear the storm hag before storms, interpret natural sounds as her song. But that doesn't explain the visual sightings, the reports of an actual female figure in the water. Skeptics argue these could be floating debris, driftwood that vaguely resembles a human shape, or in some cases, bodies of actual drowning victims that sailors have misidentified in their fear and stress. Neither explanation satisfies believers who point to the consistency of descriptions over nearly 2 centuries. The storm hag has become part of Great Lakes maritime culture. New sailors are warned about her, not necessarily as literal truth, but as a reminder that Lake Erie is dangerous, that storms can come up suddenly, and that complacency kills. Whether you believe in a supernatural entity or just in respecting the power of the lake, the storm hag serves the same purpose. She keeps sailors vigilant. Even today, in our age of modern weather forecasting and advanced navigation, there are occasional reports of the storm hag. In 2011, a recreational boater reported hearing singing on the water and seeing a pale figure in the distance. He immediately headed for shore, and within an hour, a sudden squall materialized, coming out of nowhere, according to forecasters who'd predicted clear weather. The storm hag remains one of Lake Erie's most enduring and darkest legends. She's a reminder that the Great Lakes, despite looking peaceful and beautiful on calm days, are massive bodies of water that have claimed thousands of lives. Whether she's a real entity, a misidentified natural phenomenon, or purely mythological, her legend has saved lives by making sailors cautious and respectful of the water's power. And on stormy nights on Lake Erie, when the wind howls and the waves crash, some sailors swear they can still hear her singing, calling to those foolish enough to ignore her warning. Chapter 20. The Dayton Phantom Panthers. For our final chapter, we're heading to the suburbs of Dayton for a phenomenon that's both modern and ongoing. The Dayton phantom panthers are large, black, cat-like creatures that have been reported consistently in the Dayton area and throughout southwestern Ohio for decades. We're talking about animals that look like panthers, cougars, or even jaguars, roaming through neighborhoods, crossing highways, and leaving evidence of their presence. The catch? These animals shouldn't exist in Ohio. There are no native big cats in the state, and yet people keep seeing them. The phenomenon of big black cats, sometimes called alien big cats, or ABCs in cryptozoology circles, isn't unique to Ohio. Similar reports come from all over North America, from areas where large cats aren't supposed to exist. But the Dayton area has had a particularly high concentration of sightings, enough that local police and wildlife officials have had to address the issue multiple times. The modern wave of Dayton phantom panther sightings began in the 1990s, though there are scattered earlier reports going back to the 1960s. Witnesses consistently describe seeing large, black, or very dark-colored cats, much bigger than any house cat or even a large dog, moving through suburban areas, parks, and the edges of highways. The cats are typically estimated at 50 to 80 pounds, with some witnesses claiming even larger sizes, and move with the distinctive, fluid gait of a big cat. One of the most detailed and credible sightings occurred in 2004. A Dayton police officer was on patrol in a residential area when his headlights caught something crossing the street ahead. The animal was large, sleek, and black, with a long tail and the unmistakable body shape of a large cat. The officer, who had grown up hunting and was familiar with local wildlife, immediately knew this was not a dog, not a coyote, not any animal that should be in suburban Dayton. He radioed it in, describing what he'd seen, and other units responded to search the area. They found tracks in soft ground near where the animal had crossed. Large, round paw prints consistent with a big cat, measuring about 4 inches in diameter. The tracks were photographed and later examined by wildlife experts, who confirmed they were feline in nature and far too large to be from a bobcat, the only wild cat officially present in Ohio. Throughout the 2000s and into the 2010s, reports continued to flow in. Residents reported seeing the cats in their backyards, sometimes stalking smaller animals like rabbits or even family pets. Drivers reported near misses with large black cats crossing highways at night. Trail cameras set up for deer monitoring occasionally captured images of large cat-like shapes, though the quality was often too poor for definitive identification. In 2012, a family in Kettering, a Dayton suburb, had a particularly unnerving encounter. Their dog was barking frantically at the back door around dusk. When the father looked out, he saw a large, black cat crouched in their backyard, not more than 30 feet from the house. The cat was watching their dog through the glass door. The father grabbed his camera and managed to take several photos before the cat, seemingly realizing it was being observed, turned and disappeared into the tree line behind their property. The photos, while not professional quality, clearly show a large black cat-like animal that's far too big to be domestic. So, what are these phantom panthers? The most straightforward explanation is that they're escaped or released exotic pets. Cougars, panthers, and other big cats can be legally owned in some states, though regulations vary. Ohio has had mixed regulations over the years regarding exotic animal ownership. It's entirely possible that someone owned a large black cat, perhaps a melanistic cougar or leopard, and either it escaped or they released it when they could no longer care for it. The problem with that theory is the consistency and duration of the sightings. We're talking about reports spanning decades from a relatively concentrated geographic area. If these were individual escaped pets, you'd expect the sightings to cluster around the time of the escape and then cease once the animal was recaptured, died, or moved on. Instead, sightings continue year after year, suggesting either multiple escapes, which seems unlikely, or possibly a breeding population. But a breeding population of big cats in southwestern Ohio? That's a hard sell to wildlife biologists. Big cats need large territories, substantial prey bases, and generally avoid human contact. Suburban Dayton doesn't provide the kind of habitat that would support even a single big cat long-term, let alone multiple generations. Some researchers have proposed that what people are seeing might be very large, melanistic bobcats. Bobcats do live in Ohio, and while melanism, all-black coloration, is very rare in bobcats, it's not impossible. From a distance, or in poor lighting, a large bobcat might be misidentified as a panther or cougar. But this explanation doesn't account for the size estimates. Even a very large bobcat maxes out around 40 pounds and 3 feet long, significantly smaller than the animals witnesses are describing. There's also the idea that these might be cougars, eastern cougars that were thought to be extinct, but might have small remnant populations. Cougars can have very dark coloration, and while truly black cougars are extremely rare, they're not impossible. But again, this requires us to believe that a population of one of North America's largest predators has been living in Ohio, in relatively populated areas, without definitive proof. What's interesting is that phantom panther sightings often come in waves. There will be a cluster of reports over a few weeks or months, then nothing for a while, then another cluster. This pattern suggests the animals, whatever they are, might be transient, passing through the area rather than permanently residing there. Big cats can have enormous territories and cover significant distances. It's possible these animals are moving through southwestern Ohio as part of larger ranging patterns. The Ohio Department of Natural Resources officially states that there are no confirmed populations of big cats other than bobcats in the state. They acknowledge reports but attribute them to misidentification, escaped pets, or hoaxes. They point out that despite thousands of trail cameras deployed across Ohio for wildlife management, none have captured clear, definitive images of large black cats. But the witnesses keep coming forward, people who have no reason to lie, who are familiar with local wildlife, who are adamant about what they've seen. Police officers, wildlife professionals, farmers, suburbanites, all describing the same thing: large, black, cat-like animals that shouldn't be there but apparently are. The Dayton phantom panthers represent a perfect example of a modern cryptid mystery. In an age of ubiquitous cameras and advanced monitoring technology, how can large animals consistently evade definitive documentation? Are these creatures remarkably elusive? Are witnesses misidentifying known animals? Or is there a population of big cats living on the margins of human settlement, smart enough and cautious enough to avoid being definitively proven? Whatever the truth, the sightings continue. The Dayton area and southwestern Ohio remain a hotspot for reports of big black cats. And whether they're escaped pets, misidentified bobcats, remnant cougars, or something else entirely, they've secured their place in Ohio's modern cryptid catalog. A reminder that even in our well-mapped, well-monitored world, mysteries still exist, sometimes right in our own backyards. And there you have it, folks. 10 of Ohio's weirdest, most fascinating cryptids. From frog people to lake monsters, from creatures wielding 2x4s to things that emerge from ancient bogs shrouded in mysterious green mist. Ohio might not have the fame of the Pacific Northwest when it comes to cryptid sightings, but I'd argue it has something even better. It has variety. It has creatures that are so bizarre, so specific to their locations, that they feel uniquely American in their strangeness. Whether you believe these creatures are real, whether you think they're misidentifications, hoaxes, or something we don't yet understand, the stories themselves are valuable. They're part of Ohio's folklore, part of the state's identity. They remind us that mystery still exists in the modern world, that not everything has been explained, cataloged, and filed away. So next time you're driving through Ohio, maybe take a detour. Drive past the Little Miami River at night. Visit Salt Fork State Park. Stand on the shores of Lake Erie and look out at the water. Walk the boardwalks through Cedar Bog. Who knows? You might just see something that makes you question everything you thought you knew about what's possible. Thanks for joining me on this cryptid journey through the Buckeye State. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Ohio's strangest creatures, make sure to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which state we should explore next. Until then, keep your eyes open and your cameras ready. You never know what might be watching you from the tree line.